come with me, not into the shop. Leave the counter, leave the jars, leave the warm light of the dispensary behind. Tonight, we go out. I am Master Aldworth, apothecary, and I am walking out into a field in the dark at an hour when sensible men are long asleep, because there are certain things that cannot be done in daylight. Certain traditions that require the night. The Druids understood this, the old herbalists understood it. And I, after a lifetime spent reading things that most physicians consider beneath their attention, have come to understand it too. You are welcome to walk with me. The field is just here, and in it, among the grasses and the things growing quietly in the dark, there is a plant I want to tell you about. You have almost certainly passed it today. A flat white flower head held just above the grass on a straight stem. Leaves so finely divided, they seem almost too delicate to be leaves at all, growing in a field margin, a roadside, a garden border, a crack between stones. Unremarkable, easy to overlook, easy to pull up and discard, without a second thought. Most people do, but this plant has been in human hands for longer than any civilization you have studied, longer than writing, longer than cities, longer than almost anything we have made and called important. Its pollen has been found in graves 60,000 years old. 60,000 years. Homer wrote about it. Achilles carried it to Troy. The Roman legions named it the military herb and packed it into wounds on battlefields across 3 continents. The Lakota called it medicine for the wounded. The Chinese used its stalks to ask questions of the universe. The Druids read the seasons from its growth. Women in Himalayan villages still brew it for the same purposes. Their grandmothers did, in a chain of knowledge that has never once been broken. It has been a wound herb and a fever herb, and a woman's herb and a soldier's herb, and a brewer's herb and a lover's charm, and a threshold guardian and a subject of clinical trials. It is Yarrow, and it has never been a weed, not once. Not in 60,000 years of human attention. Tonight, we are going to trace it from the beginning, from those ancient graves to the laboratories that finally found the language to explain what every healer who ever worked with it already knew. This is not a short story. I am an old man, and I do not rush, and Yarrow has a great deal of history to account for. But then, you did not come out into this field at this hour for something brief. Before we begin, while we still have the shelter of the oak at the field's edge, I would ask one small favor. If you find yourself glad you came out tonight, tell someone. A like, as they call it, a subscription to the channel. That is how other tired souls find their way here, to this field, to this hour, to this particular kind of quiet. One recommendation, passed along, like a remedy shared between neighbors, like knowledge that travels, because someone thought it worth carrying. And leave a word in the comments. When you are able, tell me where you are tonight. What city, what country? What corner of the world finds itself awake at this hour, or settling towards sleep? Someone in Vancouver with the rain doing what Vancouver rain does. Someone in Tokyo at an hour I cannot easily calculate. Someone in a bedroom that is almost warm enough, almost quiet enough, almost ready. I read Everyone. It has become, over the years, one of my favorite things about keeping this particular door open. All those people, all those places, gathered here in a dark field around a small white flower that most of them walked past this morning without stopping. That is a remarkable thing when you consider it properly. Now then, step through into the field. Mind the long grass at the edge. It is wetter than it looks. Do you see them? Just there? Where the ground levels out, those flat white heads, patient in the dark, that is Yarrow. We have 60,000 years to cover before the sun comes up. Let us begin. The night air carries something tonight. Not the cold, though there is that too. Something older than cold. Stand still for a moment. Let your eyes adjust. The field is full of shapes in this light, and half of them are Yarrow. You can see it from here. Even in the dark, those flat white heads, like small moons resting just above the grass. That is what we came for. I want to tell you something before we begin cutting. Something that I think about every time I come out at this hour. Basket in hand, the rest of the village, long asleep. The plant we are looking at tonight is not new. I do not mean new in the way that fashionable remedies are new, or new in the way that a young physician from the city might mean it. I mean something rather more significant than that. There are caves in the ancient world, old enough that the people who sheltered in them were not quite the people we would recognize as ourselves, different brow, different speech, different way of moving through the world. We call them Neanderthals now, though they had no name for themselves that we have kept. Those people buried their dead, and in those graves preserved in the soil for 60,000 years. Scientists have found pollen from Yarrow, from this plant here, now under our hands in the dark. 60,000 years is a number the mind cannot hold properly, but try for a moment. Recorded history spans perhaps 5,000 years if you are generous. The Roman Empire, at its height, was 2,000 years ago, before writing, before cities, before bronze, before any of the things we call civilization. There were people placing Yarrow with their dead. Why they placed it there, we cannot say with certainty. Was it grief made physical? Was it medicine for a journey no living healer could follow? Was it simply that Yarrow grew nearby, and they reached for what they knew? We do not know. But the reaching itself tells us something. This plant mattered to them, enough to carry into the dark with someone they had lost. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, a great deal. The formal record of Yarrow as medicine runs to at least 3,000 years, and that figure is conservative. 3,000 years of continuous documentation. Physician after physician, healer after healer, reaching across the centuries and arriving at the same jar, the same flat white head, the same finely divided leaf. There are plants that come in and out of fashion, plants that enjoyed a century of reputation and then faded from the herbals. Yarrow is not among them. Modern scholars reviewing the historical literature have called it one of the most important medicinal plants in the pharmaceutical field across all the centuries they studied. That is an unusual thing to be able to say about something growing wild in a field. Look at the leaves for a moment. You can see them even now, feathery, almost thread-like, where they divide and divide again along the stem. It is a distinctive shape. There's nothing quite like it. The scientists who gave it its formal Latin name noticed the same thing. They called it millefolium. 1,000 leaves, not precisely 1,000, of course, but the name captures something true about the character of the plant. Each leaf divides into smaller parts which divide again, which divide once more, until what you are holding seems almost too fine to be a leaf at all. The people who named it were scholars working in Latin, but the name we use in English is older than Latin scholarship in these islands. The Saxons called it Yarrow. Say it slowly if you like, Yarrow. There is something satisfying in it, something that sounds like what it means, because Yarrow in the old Saxon tongue meant healer. Not a specific healer, not a healer of one complaint or one organ. Simply healer, as the thing is what it is. As fire is fire. The Saxons were not people given to extravagant naming. When they called something the healer, they meant it as a plain description of what the thing was and what it did. And here it still is, called by a softened form of that same word. Yarrow became Yarrow somewhere across the centuries of use and mispronunciation and copying and speaking and writing it down again. But the root is there. If you look, the healer, standing in the dark in a night field, patient, as it has always been, patient. We have been coming out for it at hours like this one for a very long time. Shall we begin? The genus name came first, before we even knew there was a genus. The Greeks named it for Achilles, and the Romans kept that name because some names are too useful to replace too perfectly fitted to the thing they describe. But the story behind it is older than the naming. It reaches back into the place where history and myth stop being separate things, where a man can be half god, and a centaur can be a teacher of medicine, and both of these things can be true at once. Homer tells it in the Iliad. Achilles, greatest of the Greek warriors, did not arrive at Troy already knowing what to do with the wound. He was taught. His teacher was Charon, the centaur, who was also a physician, and who understood the properties of plants in the way that only very old and very patient teachers understand anything. What Charon taught Achilles, among other things, was Yarrow. This matters more than it might seem. The Iliad is not a botanical text. It is a poem about war and grief and the terrible cost of pride. And yet, in the middle of all of that, Yarrow appears, the herb that stops bleeding, the herb the greatest warrior of the ancient world carried with him to Troy. That is where it enters Western literature, not in a healer's manual, in an epic poem, as a thing so fundamental to the business of surviving war that it needed no further explanation. The genus name Achilles carries all of this. Every time a physician writes it in a prescription, every time a botanist writes it on a label, they are, whether they know it or not, invoking that older story, the teacher and the student, the wound and the herb that closed it. And the names accumulated around it over the centuries reflect the same story told in different languages, soldier's wound word. That is one direct, practical. The kind of name a field surgeon gives something rather than a poet. It describes precisely what the plant was used for and by whom. Knight's milfoil is another. And that one is worth pausing on because it does something interesting. Milfoil, as I mentioned earlier, comes from millefolium, 1,000-leaved, the same root as the Latin name. So Knight's milfoil is carrying two histories at once. The shape of the leaf, which goes back to the botanists, and the identity of the person who used it, which goes back to the battlefield, the knight and the 1,000 leaves, bound together in a single name. It tells you something about how long this plant served in warfare, that it accumulated names across not just Roman legions, but medieval knighthood as well. We will come to that in time. But the thread runs continuously from Charon's teaching to the Roman supply pack to the knight's saddlebag. The same plant, the same application, different centuries. There is a second story attached to Achilles and Yarrow, less well-known, stranger in its details. His mother Thetis, who was a sea goddess, and therefore intimately acquainted with what it meant to be vulnerable, is said to have made Yarrow tea after his birth. She dipped him in it, or bathed him with it, trying to give the plant's protective qualities to her son's skin. She held him by the heel as she did so. And that heel, the one she held, the one that Yarrow never touched, was the one that eventually killed him. Whether you take that story as myth or as something older trying to say something true, there is a particular kind of logic in it. The plant that stops bleeding could not protect the place it never reached. The heel that was kept back from the remedy became the weakness. We still use that phrase, the Achilles heel, a vulnerability no armor reaches. It comes, in part, from here, from Yarrow. The soldiers who came after Achilles were not heroes of epic poetry. They were legionaries, Roman, practical, concerned with logistics and supply lines and keeping men alive long enough to march another day. They had no time for mythology on campaign. Yarrow worked. They called it herba militaris, the military herb, not a poetic name, a functional one, the kind that ends up on a supply list rather than in a poem. Roman legions moved across Europe and into Britain and into Asia Minor and into North Africa. And wherever they went, Yarrow came with them, either in their packs or simply growing already wherever they arrived? Because Yarrow has always been everywhere. The application was direct and physical in a way that is worth describing properly. A soldier wounded in the field could not wait for a physician. What he could do was reach into his pack, take a handful of yarrow, and crush it, not grind it, not prepare it with any care or ceremony. Simply crush the fresh leaves between the hands or against a stone until the plant released its juices, and the mass became a rough, green poultice. That poultice went directly into the wound, packed in, pressed against the bleeding, left there. This is not delicate medicine. It is emergency medicine, the kind practiced under pressure with whatever is available. And the reason it worked, the reason Roman army physicians included it in their field supplies rather than some other plant, is that yarrow did something reliable under those conditions. It gave the wound a chance to close, rather than corrupt. The legionary with his pouch of crushed yarrow and the modern battlefield medic with his hemostatic dressing are, in practical terms, doing the same thing, separated by 2,000 years and an enormous amount of intervening knowledge, but arriving at the same answer. Dioscorides wrote about Yarrow in the 1st century. He was a Greek physician who served with the Roman army, which gave him an unusual vantage point. He had seen wounds treated in the field, and he had also studied the classical literature. His great work, De Materia Medica, became the foundation of Western herbalism for over 1,000 years following. It was copied and translated and argued over across medieval Europe, and yarrow was in it, described under its association with Achilles. But Dioscorides was a systematic man. He did not simply repeat the myth. He described the plant clinically, in terms of what it did and how to apply it. Foliage applied to wounds to close them and reduce inflammation. A preparation used internally for uterine hemorrhage, delivered as a pessary. That last detail is worth noting. By the 1st century, yarrow was already understood to work on bleeding that was not a battlefield wound. A gynecological application, carefully described, with a specific method of preparation and delivery. This was not folk knowledge being vaguely gestured at. This was a physician describing a clinical practice in enough detail that another physician could follow it. The plant's relationship with bleeding in Dioscorides is already understood as something broader than trauma. It is a property of the plant itself, applicable wherever uncontrolled bleeding presents. Pliny the Elder wrote about yarrow in roughly the same period. But Pliny was a different kind of writer entirely, and it is worth making the distinction where Dioscorides was a physician writing for other physicians. Precise and methodical, Pliny was an encyclopedist. He wanted to know everything and record everything, and he was not always as rigorous about separating the well-established from the merely reported. So what this means in practice is that Pliny's yarrow is a wider plant than Dioscorides' yarrow. More uses, more applications, more of the accumulated folk knowledge that was circulating in the Roman world, alongside the formal medical tradition. Pliny noted it for bladder complaints, for asthma, for toothache. These are not wound applications. These are the everyday domestic complaints that present in a household rather than on a battlefield. And the fact that Pliny was already writing them down in the 1st century as established knowledge rather than experimental suggestion tells us that by this point the plant had fully separated into 2 distinct traditions running in parallel. The military tradition, herba militaris, the herb that travels with armies and closes wounds in the field, and the domestic tradition, the herb that sits in the household, reached for at the first sign of a cough, or an aching tooth, or a bladder that will not settle. Both were already old by the time Pliny recorded them. He was not describing innovations. He was noting practices well enough established that an educated Roman would recognize them. Both Pliny and Dioscorides also touched on something that only became explicable much later. They noted yarrow in connection with what they called infectious diseases. Not just wounds becoming infected, but something broader. A recognition that yarrow had some relationship with a kind of illness that progressed as corruption and heat in the body. They had no word for antimicrobial. They had no framework for what bacteria were, or what it meant to inhibit their growth, but they were watching the plant carefully across many patients and many conditions, and what they observed was that it did something to the progress of certain illnesses that other plants did not. That empirical recognition, that careful watching and honest recording of effect without the vocabulary to explain the mechanism, is what good medicine looks like before it has the tools to fully understand itself. The explanation came eventually. The observation was theirs 2,000 years ago, made in the middle of campaigns and catalogues, and an empire that stretched across most of the known world. Yarrow was already everywhere that empire went. It had been there, most likely, before the empire arrived. The Roman legions dispersed eventually, as empires do, but the knowledge they carried did not disperse with them. It settled into the landscape, into the practice of the healers who came after, into the kits of the soldiers who followed in different armor, under different banners, speaking different languages. Yarrow remained in those kits through the medieval period, through the early modern wars, through conflicts so far removed from Troy that no one fighting them would have recognized the connection. The plant itself made no distinction between centuries. It simply continued to grow in disturbed ground, along roadsides and field margins, patient and available, waiting to be reached for. Medieval battlefield medicine was not sophisticated by any standard we would now apply. It was urgent, imprecise, and conducted under conditions that gave infection every possible advantage. Arrow wounds in particular presented a specific and terrible problem. The entry point was narrow, often deep, and almost impossible to clean properly. Whatever the arrowhead carried into the body, it carried thoroughly. What medieval medics learned through the accumulation of painful experience rather than any formal theory was that packing such wounds with certain substances reduced the rate of the corruption that so often followed. Yarrow was among those substances. Combined with beeswax and animal fat into a rough ointment, it could be pressed into a wound in a way that the plant alone could not. The wax and tallow gave it body, made it stay where it was placed, slowed the exposure to air and contamination. Head injuries received the same treatment. A blow to the skull that broke the skin was, in the medieval understanding, a wound like any other wound. What mattered was closing it and keeping it clean by whatever means were available. Yarrow and fat pressed against the injury, bandaged over. The household application ran alongside this. British healers of the same period made yarrow oils, infusing the fresh plant into rendered tallow, creating ointments that moved between battlefield use and domestic use without any particular distinction being made. A wound was a wound, whether it was made by an arrow or a kitchen knife or a farm implement. This is something worth noticing about Yarrow through most of its history. It did not recognize the boundary between military medicine and domestic medicine that later centuries would begin to draw. It was simply the herb for wounds. In whatever context wounds move forward several centuries. The American Civil War, a conflict of extraordinary violence and almost catastrophically inadequate medical supply, particularly in the Confederate States, as the war progressed and supply lines deteriorated. Surgeons, who had trained in formal medicine, found themselves without the materials their training assumed they would have. Soldiers, and the people who treated them, reached for what was growing nearby. Yarrow grew nearby. It grew, as it has always grown, in the disturbed ground around camps and roads and the margins of fields, brewed into a strong tea. It was used for its internal effects on bleeding and inflammation. Applied as a compress, it went back to doing what Roman legionaries had asked of it 2,000 years earlier. There is something quietly remarkable about that continuity. A Confederate field station in Virginia, a Roman campaign in Gaul, a medieval battlefield in England. The formal medical knowledge of each era was entirely different. The plant in the wound was the same. World War I brought the same pattern forward one more time. The scale of that conflict and the particular conditions of trench warfare created medical situations that outran supply in ways that even careful military planning could not fully prevent. Remote stations, cut off from regular resupply, staffed by medics who had been trained in modern antiseptic practice, but did not always have modern antiseptics to hand. Yarrow tea, Yarrow poultices, the same applications, in the same emergencies, in the mud of Flanders rather than the dust of Gaul. The herb that marched with Rome had not retired. It simply waited, as it had always waited, for the moment when everything more sophisticated ran out and something reliable was needed. It was always there. It is always there. Look down. Just here at our feet, even in this light, you can see it. There is a particular kind of plant that does not need to be carried. It simply follows. Yarrow is one of those plants. It prefers disturbed ground. Ground that has been turned, walked over, camped upon, grazed, dug, and moved through repeatedly. Ground that human settlement creates wherever it goes, the edges of roads, the margins of fields, the places where armies stop for the night and move on in the morning, leaving the soil churned and open. Into that ground, Yarrow moves. It does not require cultivation. It does not require anyone to decide to bring it. It simply appears in the wake of human movement, as if it understood that where people go, wounds follow, and wounds are its business. This is how a plant that originated in the temperate regions of Eurasia eventually came to be documented in the materia medica of China, of Persia, of the Indian subcontinent, of the Himalayan foothills of the Ottoman world. Not primarily through deliberate transplantation. So some of that happened too, largely through the simple fact that Yarrow followed the routes, trade routes, war routes, migration routes, the disturbed ground of human passage. Modern botanical surveys confirm what the historical records suggest. Achilles millefolium and its close relatives span Europe, the Mediterranean, and Asia in a distribution that traces human movement across the Old World with remarkable fidelity. It is one of the most geographically widespread traditional vulnerries ever documented, which is another way of saying that wherever people went and got hurt, they eventually found yarrow growing nearby and learned what it could do. There is something almost companionable about that, a plant that keeps pace with human beings, that turns up in the margins of every place we have settled or passed through that has been, in some quiet and consistent way, alongside us for the entirety of recorded history and considerably before it. Let us go east, then follow the roots. China developed one of the most extensive and carefully documented botanical traditions in the ancient world, and yarrow appears in it, though with a character somewhat different from the European tradition. The Chinese found in it the same wound properties, the same ability to address bleeding and inflammation, but they also found something else. Something the Greek and Roman sources do not particularly emphasize. They found it useful for animal bites. For snake bite specifically, the application of yarrow to envenomation injuries is a significant departure from the simple vulnerary tradition, and it is worth thinking about why it appears in the Chinese record. Snake venom creates a particular kind of localized tissue damage, hot, rapidly spreading, accompanied by significant swelling and a risk of infection at the bite site. What the Chinese practitioners were observing was that yarrow applied to such injuries did something useful to that pattern of damage. We now have some understanding of why the antimicrobial properties that Pliny and Dioscorides noticed in the context of infectious disease are also present at the site of an animal bite. The compounds in the plant that reduce inflammation are relevant to venom-induced inflammation as well as trauma-induced inflammation. The Chinese application was not as strange as it might first appear. It was a logical extension of the same properties, applied to a different presenting condition. Chinese traditional medicine also understood yarrow as a plant that worked on the liver, specifically on what TCM calls liver qi stagnation. Qi, in the Chinese medical framework, is the vital energy that flows through the body along specific pathways. When that flow becomes sluggish or obstructed in the liver, the effects are felt broadly. Indigestion, irritable bowel, a sense of tightness and pressure in the upper abdomen, bile that does not move freely, a general heaviness that settles into the body and resists easy explanation. Yarrow, in the Chinese understanding, moves that stagnation. It encourages the liver's proper function, gets things flowing again. This is not the wound application, not the bleeding application, not the antimicrobial application. It is something quieter and more internal, addressed to the chronic rather than the acute, to the slow accumulation of dysfunction rather than the emergency. And yet it connects, when you look carefully, to what the Persian and European traditions also observed about Yarrow and the liver. Different theoretical frameworks, different vocabularies, different explanations for why the liver matters and how it fails. But the same plant being directed at the same organ by practitioners who had no contact with one another and no shared language. That pattern of independent agreement is one of the most reliable signals in traditional botanical medicine. When cultures, separated by oceans and centuries, arrive at the same application through their own observation, the application is usually worth taking seriously. But the Chinese also gave Yarrow a role that has no parallel anywhere in the Western tradition. A role that moves it entirely out of medicine and into something older and stranger. The I Ching. The Book of Changes, one of the oldest texts in existence, a system of divination and philosophical inquiry that has been in continuous use in China for at least 3,000 years. The classical method of consulting the I Ching requires 50 stalks, and those stalks, in the original and traditional practice, are Yarrow stalks. Not any stalks, specifically Yarrow. The stalks are divided and counted in an elaborate ritual process, the resulting numbers determining which of the 64 hexagrams is relevant to the question being asked. The process is slow and deliberate, requiring full attention and a kind of meditative focus. The stalks pass through the hands repeatedly. The pattern that emerges is understood to reflect something true about the situation being examined. Why Yarrow was chosen for this, rather than some other plant, is not entirely clear from the historical record. There are theories. Yarrow grows straight and uniform, making it well suited to the counting process. It was already a plant of significance and reputation, already understood as something that operated between the physical world and something less easily named. Some scholars suggest the plant's ancient associations with protection and healing made it an appropriate intermediary for a practice concerned with navigation and guidance. Whatever the reason, the effect is that in China, Yarrow occupied a position with no equivalent in European botanical tradition. It was simultaneously a wound herb and an oracular instrument, a plant of the body and a plant of the mind, used for the most practical of physical emergencies, and also for the most profound questions a person might bring to a quiet room with 50 stalks and a question they could not answer alone. We are out here tonight harvesting in accordance with a tradition that also reaches beyond the purely practical, the hour, the method, the intention behind the cutting. It is worth noticing that we are not the only culture to have understood Yarrow as something that operates in more than one register at once. The Chinese were not alone in that understanding, but we will come to that in its proper time. Now further west into Persia. The great Persian and Arab trade networks of the medieval period were among the most significant conduits of botanical knowledge the world has ever seen. Goods moved along those routes, but so did ideas, and so did plants. A herb, known in one medical tradition, would be encountered by a physician traveling through, described to a scholar who recognized its properties, written into an Arabic or Persian text, and thus absorbed into a new tradition, with a new set of questions being asked of it. Yarrow moved this way, from the Mediterranean world into Persian medicine, carried along the same routes that brought silk westward and glassware eastward, and from Persian medicine southward and eastward into the Indian subcontinent, where it was absorbed first into the Unani tradition, the system of medicine derived from Greek sources and developed across the Islamic world into its own distinct and sophisticated form. It is worth pausing on the Unani tradition for a moment, because it is less familiar to most people than either the European or the Chinese systems. Unani medicine is the direct heir of the Greek and Roman medical tradition, preserved and extended by Islamic scholars after the fall of Rome, translated into Arabic and Persian, and developed further across several centuries of serious intellectual attention. When European physicians of the medieval period wanted access to classical Greek medicine, they frequently accessed it through Arabic translations. Yarrow was in those texts. It arrived in South Asian Unani practice, not as a foreign novelty, but as a known quantity, its properties already described, its applications already established. The Unani physicians added their own observations, adapted its use to the specific conditions and patient populations they worked with, and passed it forward into the living tradition that continues today. Yarrow also reached Ayurvedic practice, though by a more indirect route. It is not an indigenous Indian plant in the way that turmeric or ashwagandha are. It arrived from outside, through the Persian and trade connections, rather than arising from within the Ayurvedic system itself. But once it arrived, Ayurvedic practitioners absorbed it into their framework with characteristic precision. In Ayurvedic adaptation, Yarrow was understood as a pitta-balancing herb. Pitta in Ayurvedic theory is the principle associated with heat, fire, and metabolic activity. When pitta becomes excessive, the body shows it in inflammation, in bleeding that will not resolve, in the kind of internal heat that disrupts digestion and disturbs the organs. Bitter, cooling plants are the traditional Ayurvedic response to excess pitta. Yarrow fitted naturally into this category. Its pronounced bitterness, its cooling effect on inflamed tissue, its action on uterine bleeding, all of these placed it among the pitta-managing herbs. Beyond this, Ayurvedic practice also recognized it as a uterine tonic, useful for regulating and supporting female reproductive function in ways that connected directly to what Dioscorides had described in De Materia Medica over 1,000 years earlier and half a world away. The same plant, describing itself accurately in two entirely different medical languages, being understood correctly in both. The Himalayan and Tibetan folk systems absorbed it as well, further complicating the assumption common in European herbalism that yarrow is essentially a Western plant. Village medicine in the Himalayan foothills used it for the same range of conditions that appear in every other tradition that encountered it. Wounds, bleeding, fever, digestive complaints. The specifics of preparation varied. The plant and its applications did not. By the time its documented distribution is fully mapped, yarrow had been integrated into the medical practice of cultures spanning from the Atlantic coast of Europe to the high passes of the Himalayas. The claim that it belongs to any single tradition is simply not supportable when confronted with the evidence. The Ottoman world received yarrow through the same scholarly and trade channels that carried so much else across that vast empire. Ottoman herbalism found in it applications that continued the Greco-Roman legacy while developing their own character. A preparation for hemorrhoids delivered as a sitz bath is documented in Ottoman practice, a use that connects directly to the Roman tradition of yarrow for conditions involving inflammation and venous congestion, adapted into a specifically Ottoman domestic context. The sitz bath is not a dramatic application. It is the kind of quiet, practical remedy that gets used regularly in ordinary households, never written about with much ceremony, but present in the daily life of people managing the ordinary indignities of physical existence. That it appears in Ottoman records tells us that yarrow had penetrated beyond the formal medical literature into the texture of everyday domestic practice. It had become, in the Ottoman world as in the European world, simply one of the things you kept and reached for. Iranian traditional medicine developed a relationship with yarrow that is particularly well documented and particularly interesting for its range. Compound formulas including yarrow appear in Persian medical texts for gastrointestinal pain, for menstrual disorders, for what the texts describe in terms that correspond to what we would now call diabetes management. That last application deserves attention. The management of blood sugar through botanical means is a sophisticated area of traditional medicine, and the appearance of yarrow in this context suggests that Persian physicians were observing effects in their patients that went well beyond the plant's wound healing reputation. They were watching it do something to metabolic function, to the way the body processed what it consumed, and they were recording it with sufficient care that the record survived. Perhaps most striking of all is a use documented in modern Iranian clinical practice that draws a direct line from the oldest folk applications to contemporary medicine. A distillate of yarrow, used as a mouthwash in combination with standard solutions, was found to provide superior relief for oral mucositis, the painful inflammation of the mouth's mucous membranes that frequently accompanies chemotherapy treatment. A preparation rooted in traditional Iranian botanical knowledge, tested against modern clinical standards, relieving suffering in patients undergoing one of the most aggressive treatments medicine currently applies. The thread from the Persian physician writing yarrow into a compound formula for gastrointestinal pain to the clinical trial measuring its effect on chemotherapy side effects is unbroken. The knowledge was passed forward. It was adapted and refined. It was tested by methods the original physicians could not have imagined. That is what genuine botanical knowledge looks like across the very long term. Not fashion, not accumulated, belief that was never questioned, something that continues to demonstrate its value when subjected to entirely new kinds of scrutiny. The routes it traveled to arrive at that clinical trial stretched across the entire width of the old world, through a dozen languages and as many centuries. And Yarrow traveled all of them. There is a question that runs underneath everything we have covered so far tonight. Not a question about yarrow specifically, a larger question about whether the properties of a plant are discovered or whether they are simply recognized. Discovery implies that the knowledge did not exist until someone found it. Recognition implies something different, that the plant was always doing what it does, and that human beings paying careful attention arrive at the same understanding independently, because the plant keeps demonstrating the same things to whoever watches it closely enough. The cross-cultural record of yarrow argues strongly for recognition over discovery. We have already seen it in the agreement between Chinese, Persian, Ayurvedic, and European traditions. Now, consider this. When European settlers arrived in North America, they brought yarrow with them. It was in their medicine kits, in their kitchen garden seed packets, in the accumulated botanical knowledge they carried across the ocean from the old world. And they found, when they arrived, that yarrow was already there. A different species in some cases, related species certainly, but the same genus, growing in the same kinds of disturbed ground, doing the same things. And the peoples who had lived alongside it for generations had already learned what it could do. Without any contact with Greece, Rome, Persia, or China, without Homer or Dioscorides or the I Ching or the trade routes that carried botanical knowledge across the old world, through their own careful, sustained observation of a plant that kept presenting itself and kept proving useful. That is the thing worth sitting with for a moment. The knowledge did not travel to North America. It arose there, from the same plant, doing the same things, being watched by people who paid close attention and remembered carefully what they saw. The Teton Dakota. The Lakota people called it Dao Pai Pezuta. It translates as medicine for the wounded. Not medicine for wounds, medicine for the wounded. There is a distinction in that phrasing worth sitting with. It is not describing a property of the plant in isolation. It is describing a relationship between the plant and a person in a particular condition. The wounded person, the person who has been hurt and needs something to help them through. The name places the person at the center of it, not the injury, not the mechanism, not the compound in the leaf that stops the bleeding. The wounded, as if the plant knew who it was for. They also called it life medicine. That designation appears across several Native American traditions in connection with yarrow, and it is not a clinical category. It is a statement of significance. This plant is among the ones that keep people alive. This plant belongs at the center of the healer's knowledge, not at the edges. When a person is in serious trouble, This is one of the things you reach for. Life medicine is a high designation. It is not given to every useful plant. It is given to the ones that have demonstrated across generations of use in communities where the consequences of being wrong were immediate and serious, that they can be trusted at the moments that matter most. Yarrow earned it. The Cherokee used it, the Iroquois used it, the Mohegan used it, the Dindah, the Cheyenne, the Nez Percé Beg, each tradition with its own relationship to the plant, its own specific preparations, its own understanding of what yarrow was for and how to ask it for what it offered. And across all of them, the same core applications appear that appear in every other tradition that encountered yarrow seriously. Wounds and bleeding, fever, digestive complaints, respiratory troubles, inflammation of many kinds. The Cherokee, Iroquois, and Mohegan used it specifically as a digestive aid for swellings and inflammatory conditions of the gut. This is the same application that appears in the Chinese TCM tradition, in the Persian compound formulas, in Pliny's domestic recommendations. 3 continents, no shared history of botanical exchange. The same observation about the same plant made independently by people who had no way of knowing that others, far away, and in entirely different circumstances, had arrived at exactly the same conclusion. That convergence is not coincidence. It is the plant being consistent, behaving the same way for every set of eyes that watched it carefully enough and long enough to see what it was doing. The Nez Percé, the Nimipu, prepared yarrow poultices for wounds and brewed yarrow teas for colds. Practical, direct applications, the kind that develop from sustained use in a community where the plant is available and the need is real. Their healers treated yarrow as what it was called, life medicine. Something that belonged in the healer's kit, as a matter of course, reached for with confidence because it had earned that confidence through long demonstration. The wound applications are perhaps the least surprising, given everything we have already covered tonight. But some of the specific uses in the North American indigenous traditions are worth dwelling on individually, because they show the range of what close attention to a plant can uncover when that attention is sustained across generations. The Anishinaabe of Manitoba applied yarrow leaf oil to wasp stings. Not a battlefield wound, not a medical emergency, a common domestic injury, painful and inflaming, the kind that presents in summer to anyone working outdoors near nests or working with fruit that wasps find attractive. The application of yarrow oil to the sting reduced the swelling and eased the pain. The same anti-inflammatory properties that helped close battlefield wounds were relevant here too, at a completely different scale and in a completely different context. This is one of the things that marks a genuinely useful plant, rather than a narrowly useful one. Its properties are not conditional on the severity of the situation. They apply equally to the small ordinary injuries of daily life as to the serious ones. Yarrow did not reserve itself for soldiers and surgeons. It was equally available to the person, stung in a summer garden, equally willing to do what it could for a smaller hurt. Some indigenous groups smoked dried yarrow leaves for respiratory complaints. For catarrh, the excessive mucus production that accompanies certain respiratory conditions and makes breathing labored and sleep difficult. This is not an application that appears prominently in the European written tradition, though European herbalism certainly knew yarrow as a plant with respiratory relevance. It represents a distinct method of delivery, the inhalation of the plant's volatile compounds directly into the respiratory passages that needed them. There is a coherent logic in this that does not require any theoretical framework to appreciate. If a plant reduces inflammation when applied to the skin, and the problem is inflammation inside the airways, then delivering the plant's active properties directly to those airways through the breath is a reasonable extension of the same principle. Whether this method was arrived at through deliberate reasoning or through accumulated trial and observation, the thinking behind it is sound. Burns and skin infections, including inflammatory skin conditions like eczema, also appear in the North American indigenous record as applications for yarrow. Damaged, inflamed, or infected skin. The same plant doing the same thing to different presentations of the same underlying problem. Heat, inflammation, disruption to the protective surface of the body. Yarrow brought to bear on all of them, reliably, across different nations and different landscapes. The Cheyenne and Navajo traditions used Yarrow decoctions, preparations made by simmering the leaves and stems in water, for digestive upset, for muscle aches, and for menstrual discomfort. These three applications together form a picture that is essentially identical to what Pliny recorded in the 1st century, to what the Persian compound formulas addressed, and to what the Ayurvedic tradition described under its own vocabulary: digestive function, musculoskeletal pain, and female reproductive support. Three areas where Yarrow consistently demonstrated usefulness across every tradition that worked with it seriously, on every continent where it grew. Independent confirmation, arrived at without communication, across the full width of the human world. The Cheyenne and Iroquois also used Yarrow in ceremony. Specifically, they burned or smoked it in rituals to spiritually cleanse warriors returning from conflict. This use exists at the boundary between medicine and something else, between the treatment of physical wounds and the acknowledgement that a person returning from violence carries something that requires more than physical attention. The body can be examined and dressed and given time to heal, but the person inside the body has seen and done things that leave their own kind of mark, and the community knew this, and the ceremony addressed it. The smoke of Yarrow rising around a returning warrior is both practical and symbolic at once. Practically, Yarrow smoke has antimicrobial properties. It was not an irrational thing to expose a person who had been in the field to, symbolically, it was the plant that closes wounds being asked to close something less visible. The same herb that the warrior had likely carried into battle, that had been pressed into injuries in the field, now burning gently at the threshold of the village as the warrior came home. There is a completeness to that. The plant present at both ends of the journey. The protective uses, documented among the Anishinaabe and related peoples, extend this logic further. Dried yarrow mixed with sand, poured across thresholds, placed around the perimeter of homes, a boundary marker. A declaration that the plant's protective qualities, understood in the medical sense as very real and very reliable, extended in the folk understanding to protection of a broader kind. The threshold of the home made safer by the presence of the same herb that made the body safer. This is not superstition in the dismissive sense that word is sometimes used. It is a coherent extension of observed reality into the domains of life where observation alone cannot reach. The plant works on wounds, the plant works on inflammation, the plant works on the warrior's return. Perhaps the plant works also on the invisible boundaries that matter to a community. The reasoning is consistent, even if the mechanism is different. And as I mentioned a moment ago, we will see this same protective threshold use appear in European folk tradition when we come to it. Different cultures, separated by an ocean, placing the same plant at their doorways for reasons they would not have been able to compare because they did not know the other was doing the same thing. Latin American folk herbalism developed its own relationship with yarrow, shaped by indigenous knowledge, by Spanish colonial medicine, and by the living tradition that emerged as those streams mixed across centuries of shared life. The applications documented in Latin American practice include wound care and the management of joint and muscle aches, both of which we have encountered many times by now. But Latin American herbalists also used yarrow specifically as a blood purifier. That term appears in many traditional systems and means something slightly different in each context. In the Latin American folk tradition, it refers broadly to preparations used to help the body clear what it has accumulated and is struggling to process: chronic skin conditions, persistent fatigue, the general heaviness that settles into a body carrying too much for too long. These are the conditions for which a blood purifier was prescribed, and yarrow's combination of liver-supporting, anti-inflammatory, and gently diuretic properties made it genuinely suited to address them. The blood purifier concept appears in Latin American herbalism in connection with yarrow. It appears in European folk medicine. It appears in Persian medicine. It appears in Ayurvedic practice and in Chinese medicine, each time under a different name and within a different theoretical framework. Each time the same plant, each time the same broad recognition that Yarrow does something helpful to the body's ability to manage what it is carrying. Cultures that developed their knowledge of Yarrow without reference to one another kept arriving at the same place. Not identical knowledge, not identical preparations, not identical ceremonies, but the same plant identified as significant, trusted with serious conditions, given names that reflect the weight of that trust. Medicine for the wounded, life. Medicine, the healer. Different languages. The same understanding. The field is quiet around us. The whiteheads of the Yarrow catch whatever light there is, here and there among the grasses. And they are very still. They have been still in fields like this one, on every continent where they grow, while people in the dark paid attention and remembered what they learned. That is a long vigil, longer than most things we can name. A plant that has been in continuous use for 60,000 years accumulates, names the way an old river accumulates bends. Not by design, by the simple pressure of time and use and the need of each generation to call the thing in front of them something that made sense in their own language, their own landscape, their own understanding of what the plant was for. Yarrow has more names than most, which is itself a kind of testimony. Milfoil, that one we have already met. The thousand-leaved, carried forward from the Latin into common English speech, used by herbalists and country people alike for centuries. It describes the leaf, which is the most immediately striking thing about the plant when you first encounter it. Before you know what it does, you see what it looks like. And what it looks like is a leaf, divided so many times into such fine segments that the word thousand feels appropriate, even though it is not literally accurate. Herb of 7 cures, that name is more ambitious. It does not describe the plant's appearance, it describes the plant's reputation, the accumulated weight of what healers across generations had found it useful for. 7 was not a precise count. 7 was a number that meant many, that meant enough to be remarkable, that meant this plant is not a single-use remedy kept for one specific complaint. It is something broader than that, something that earns a place in the kit because of the range of what it can address. Sanguinary, that name comes from the Latin for blood, and it is direct in a way that some of the others are not. This is the blood herb, the herb associated with blood in all its aspects, the stopping of it, the moving of it, the management of conditions where it was doing something it should not. Apothecaries used it. Physicians writing in the learned tradition used it. It is a professional name more than a folk name, precise in its reference to the plant's most documented property, death flower. That one requires a moment's pause. It sounds ominous, and it is meant to, but the ominousness is not about the plant being dangerous. It is about where the plant was most reliably found, and what it was most consistently associated with: battlefields, graves, the disturbed ground of violent human activity. Yarrow grew on that ground, and was used on that ground, and the people who named it Death Flower were not expressing fear of it. They were noting the context in which it appeared most prominently in their experience. The healer of the battlefield, the flower of the place where men died. Those two things were the same thing in the same plant. And the name held both. Old man's mustard, snake's grass, 100-leaved grass. These are wayside names, names used by people who were not physicians or apothecaries, who encountered Yarrow along roadsides and in field margins and called it what it looked or smelled like. The pungency of Yarrow, its distinctive, sharp, aromatic quality, earned it the mustard comparison. The fine divided leaves earned it the grass comparisons. Snake's grass suggests either a connection to snake habitats or possibly an echo of the Chinese and indigenous American uses for snakebite that found their way into European folk knowledge through routes we can no longer trace precisely. And nosebleed, that name deserves its own consideration, and we will come to it shortly. because it points to something about Yarrow that confused and fascinated herbalists for centuries. But first, Hildegard. Hildegard von Bingen was a 12th century abbess composer, theologian and naturalist working in the Rhineland at a time when the formal boundaries between those activities were considerably less fixed than they later became. She was one of the most remarkable minds of the medieval period, by any measure, and she left behind a body of botanical and medical writing that stands as one of the most significant documents of medieval herbalism. She wrote about Yarrow with the confidence of someone who had used it extensively and thought carefully about what it did. Her preparation for insomnia is one of the most specific and unusual Yarrow recipes in the medieval record. Yarrow cooked with fennel, the resulting mixture squeezed into a cloth, the cloth wrapped around the head, not drunk, not applied to a wound, held against the skull of someone who could not sleep. The warmth and the volatile compounds of both plants released slowly against the skin. Hildegard understood something that more systematic medical writers sometimes missed, which is that the method of application shapes what a plant does and where it does it. The same herb prepared differently delivers different things. Yarrow wrapped warm around the head for insomnia is not the same preparation as yarrow packed into a wound, even though the plant is the same plant. For nosebleeds, she combined yarrow with fresh dill, applying the mixture to the forehead, the temples, and the chest. Again, external application to regions of the body, not directly at the site of the problem. This is Hildegard working with the understanding that the body is a connected system, that what happens at the forehead and temples influences what happens in the passages of the nose, that the chest carries and distributes what the heart and the blood require. She also used yarrow as a drink, an infusion taken internally for what she described as internal injuries, and for tertian fevers, the kind that returned every third day in a regular pattern, the kind we now associate with certain forms of malaria. Yarrow tea drunk as medicine, not applied as a poultice. The same plant, in a completely different mode of action, addressing completely different conditions. And she included yarrow in preparations specifically for women's menstrual health, regulating and supporting the cycle. This application, as we have seen, appears in Dioscorides, in Ayurvedic practice, in the Cheyenne and Navajo traditions. Hildegard was not innovating here. She was working within a very long tradition of observation that had repeatedly arrived at the same understanding, but she was applying it with her own characteristic precision, embedding it within her broader theological and natural philosophical framework. Nicholas Culpeper came several centuries later, in the 17th century, working in London as a physician and astrologer, and writing for an audience that was not the learned physician, but the ordinary person who needed practical guidance on what to do when someone in their household was ill. Culpeper described yarrow in terms that are straightforward even by modern standards. Drying and binding, he said, "It restrains violent bleedings. The leaves cure wounds, good for inflammations, ulcers, and moist running sores." Drying and binding are energetic terms from the older medical tradition, describing the plant's functional character rather than its chemistry. A drying herb reduces excess moisture. A binding herb tightens and contracts. Together, applied to a wound that is bleeding and weeping, they describe what yarrow was observed to do. The tissue contracts, the moisture reduces, the wound closes. Culpeper was not speculating. He was compiling the accumulated clinical observation of his predecessors and adding his own. By his time, Yarrow's wound applications were so thoroughly established that he could state them without argument as plain facts about the world that his readers could verify for themselves. John Gerard, writing in 1597, noted something stranger, that yarrow sniffed directly could induce a nosebleed. This is the amphoteric paradox, and it fascinated everyone who noticed it. Here was a plant that could stop bleeding when applied to a wound, and also start bleeding when applied to the nose. The same plant, used in two slightly different ways, producing opposite effects on the same physiological process. The word amphoteric from the Greek for both, eventually became the technical term for this property. A plant that can act in either direction on a given system, responding to what the body actually needs rather than always pushing in the same direction. Stop the bleeding here. Start it there. Regulate rather than simply suppress or stimulate. Apothecaries noted this specifically. Yarrow stopped bleeding externally, but could be used to promote it internally in cases of what they called plethora, an excess accumulation of blood that needed to be moved. The deliberate induction of a nosebleed was not harm. It was therapeutic release, used in the same tradition as bloodletting to relieve pressure and restore balance. Maud Grieve, writing in her Modern Herbal in 1931, captured this quality with a precision that had eluded some of the earlier writers. She described yarrow as acting either way on blood flow, toning excess where there was too much, mobilizing stagnation where things had slowed and thickened and stopped moving as they should. Acting either way, that is a remarkably economical description of something that takes considerably longer to explain properly. The plant reads the situation and responds to it where there is too much movement. It slows where there is too little. It encourages. It does not apply the same intervention regardless of context. This quality, once properly understood, explains why yarrow appears in so many different and apparently contradictory applications across its history. It is not that different traditions were confused about what the plant did. It is that the plant genuinely does different things in different circumstances, always in the direction of what the body needs rather than always in the same fixed direction. A plant of that kind is genuinely unusual. Most plants push in one direction. Yarrow reads the situation. No wonder they called it the herb of 7 cures. They might reasonably have called it more. We have been talking about what yarrow does. Let me talk for a while about how it was worked with, because the knowledge of a plant and the craft of preparing it are two different things. And the second is as important as the first. A plant poorly prepared delivers less than it could. A plant well prepared at the right moment, from the right part, in the right form for the condition being addressed, delivers everything it has to give. Apothecaries understood this, it was, in fact, the central practical knowledge of the trade, not simply which plant for which complaint, but how to prepare it, in what form, for what kind of patient, in what season, with what carrier, over what period of time. Yarrow rewards that kind of attention more than most. Let me begin with what the plant actually contains, because the chemistry, even described in the older language of the apothecary, rather than the modern language of the laboratory, explains a great deal about why so many different preparations were developed for so many different conditions. There are volatile oils. These are the aromatic compounds responsible for yarrow's sharp, distinctive smell, the ones that rise into the night air when you crush a fresh leaf between your fingers. You can smell it now if you have been handling the stems, that clean, slightly medicinal, faintly bitter sharpness. That is the volatile oil announcing itself. There are tannins, the binding, astringent compounds that contract tissue and reduce the weeping and seeping that an open wound produces. When a traditional herbalist described a plant as drying and binding, they were describing, in the language available to them, the action of the tannins. There are flavonoids, which work on inflammation through mechanisms the old apothecaries observed clearly in their patients without having the vocabulary to explain. The swelling goes down. The heat reduces, the tissue settles. They did not know why. They knew reliably that it happened. And there are bitters, the compounds that act primarily on the digestive system, stimulating the secretions that help food move and be properly processed, encouraging the liver and the gallbladder to do their work, settling the spasms that produce the cramping and flux that made life uncomfortable and occasionally dangerous in eras before clean water and reliable food preservation. Together, these 4 classes of compounds explain why yarrow is simultaneously a wound herb, an anti-inflammatory, an antimicrobial, an antispasmodic, and digestive. It is not doing one thing. It is doing several things at once, each compound addressing a different aspect of the condition being treated the whole greater than the sum of its parts. The apothecary who reached for Yarrow in a complex case was, without knowing the chemistry, reaching for a plant that brought multiple tools to a single problem. This is why it appears so consistently across such a wide range of conditions. Not because healers were confused about what it was for, but because it was genuinely useful across that range. The volatile oils in particular were prized as apothecary craft, became more sophisticated, when distillation became an established part of the apothecary's work. Yarrow oil was among those most valued. The smell intensifies in distillation into something extraordinary, deep, blue. In some preparations, due to a compound called chamazulene, formed in the distillation process itself, powerfully aromatic, with antimicrobial properties considerably stronger than the fresh plant alone could deliver. An ointment containing yarrow oil resisted spoilage better than one without it. The same antimicrobial properties that protected the patient's wound also preserved the preparation itself. A self-protecting medicine, which was a practical advantage of real significance in an era before sealed containers and temperature-controlled storage. The apothecary who made a large batch of salve in the autumn and needed it to remain effective through the winter valued this quality enormously. The color of the distilled oil was itself a point of professional pride. A well-made yarrow oil ran blue-green, sometimes almost inky in concentration. Sometimes the pale clear blue of shallow water over white stone. Apothecaries learned to read the color as an indication of quality. A pale or yellowish oil had lost something in the distillation. A deep blue oil had been made correctly from good material, at the right moment in the plant cycle. That moment mattered enormously, and experienced apothecaries were precise about it. Rural apothecaries and household healers who gathered their own material knew that yarrow harvested in July, at the height of its bloom, carried more volatile oil than yarrow gathered earlier or later. The plant puts its full chemical effort into the flowering tops at that moment. The smell is strongest, the color deepest, the potency highest. The autumn salve-making sessions that would produce the ointments carrying a household through the winter began with July's harvest, cut in the morning after the dew had lifted, dried carefully in shade to preserve the volatile oils that direct sun would drive off. The upper flowering tops were the part most consistently preferred across the apothecary literature. Not the roots, though those had uses, not the lower stem. Though that was not discarded, the flowering tops, where the volatile oils and flavonoids concentrated most heavily, where the plant was doing its most active chemical work. For teas, for salves, for tinctures, for oils, for powders, intended for wound care, the flowering tops were what you wanted. Now the preparations themselves worked through in something like the order a well-stocked apothecary would have them arranged in their mind. The oldest and simplest is the fresh poultice. Leaves crushed by hand or chewed, applied directly to the wound. We have encountered this form many times tonight, from the Roman legionary to the Lakota healer. It requires nothing except the plant and the hands. No equipment, no preparation time, no special knowledge, beyond knowing which plant to reach for and being close enough to reach it. Chewing the leaves before application deserves particular mention, because it appears in the record across multiple traditions, and it is not simply a matter of convenience or urgency. The action of chewing partially breaks down the plant material in a way that crushing between stones does not quite replicate, and it mixes the plant with saliva, which has its own mild antimicrobial properties, and which changes the texture of the preparation in ways that make it adhere more effectively to the wound site. The spit poultice was used not only for cuts and injuries, but for insect and spider bites, pressed directly and firmly against the site of the sting, and for toothache. The chewed leaf held against a painful tooth, the volatile oils and the mild analgesic compounds in the plant releasing directly against the inflamed tissue of the gum. This is medicine as immediate as anything can be. The plant in the mouth, the pain in the tooth, nothing between them but attention and intention. The dried powder was a step up in preparation, requiring time and the equipment to dry and grind properly, but producing something more versatile and considerably more portable than fresh plant material. Yarrow's feathery, Leaves dry readily, which was one of the genuine practical advantages the plant offered to apothecaries preparing in bulk. Once dried, the aerial parts ground into a fine powder that could be dusted directly onto cuts and nosebleeds to arrest bleeding. The powder form concentrated the tannins particularly effectively, producing a styptic that could be applied precisely to the site of bleeding with minimal disturbance to the surrounding tissue. Apothecaries kept this powder as a standard stock item, replenished regularly because it was used regularly, not for extraordinary cases. For the ordinary injuries that presented in any community throughout the year, the cuts and abrasions and minor lacerations that did not require a physician, but did require something reliable to stop the bleeding and reduce the risk of what followed, if left unattended. The infusion served multiple purposes, and an experienced apothecary would have prepared it differently depending on which purpose was intended. A gentle infusion, steeped briefly in water, that had just come off the boil, delivered a lighter preparation suitable for regular internal use, for the digestive complaints, and the mild fevers and the slow accumulation of inflammation that needed consistent gentle attention over time. A strong infusion, steeped longer, approaching a decoction in its concentration, produced something more suitable for wound washing. An injury too large or too awkward for a direct poultice could be bathed repeatedly in strong yarrow tea, cleaned and disinfected with each application. The antimicrobial properties of the infusion, reducing the risk of the corruption that killed so many patients, not from the wound itself, but from what moved into the wound afterward. Compresses soaked in this strong infusion and held against inflamed tissue delivered the plant's properties slowly and continuously, the wet cloth keeping the affected area medicated and moist for as long as the compress was maintained. This was the preparation of choice for deep inflammation, for the kind of swelling and heat that needed sustained attention rather than a single acute intervention. Macerated oils required the most patience of any yarrow preparation. Dried flowering tops packed into good olive oil, the vessel sealed and set in a warm place. Left for several weeks while the oil slowly drew out the fat-soluble compounds that water-based preparations could not reach. The resulting oil ran golden and fragrant, carrying the flavonoids and the volatile oil residues in a form that penetrated the skin effectively when rubbed into sprains, bruises, and the swollen, aching tissue around varicose veins. Salves were made from this oil by warming it with beeswax until the wax dissolved, then pouring the mixture into small pots to cool and set. The salve held its form at room temperature, could be applied with a finger to exactly the area that needed it, and stayed where it was placed rather than running off as an oil alone would do. A well-made yarrow salve had a faint blue-green tinge from the volatile oils carried into the wax, and it smelled of the plant in a concentrated and pleasant way that patients found reassuring. Vinegar extracts appear in apothecary recipes from the 19th century, particularly for musculoskeletal complaints. Yarrow macerated in good vinegar. The preparation soaked into compresses for sprained ankles and swollen joints. The acidity of the vinegar worked alongside the plant's own anti-inflammatory compounds. It was a practical solvent for apothecaries without reliable access to high-proof spirits. The resulting preparation was effective, stable, and inexpensive enough to be available to patients who could not afford the more costly tinctures. The brandy tincture occupied a different register entirely. Apothecary handbooks listed yarrow among the cordial herbs, plants suitable for administration in spirits as a restorative for shock, faintness, and acute collapse. A cordial in the older sense was not merely a pleasant drink. It was a medicine for the heart and the vital spirits, something that could bring a person back from the edge of losing consciousness. Yarrow in brandy, given to someone in shock after a significant injury, worked on multiple levels at once. The spirits provided immediate stimulation to the circulation. The yarrow addressed the underlying disruption to blood flow and tissue integrity. It was a preparation that made particular sense in the context of battlefield medicine and the more violent accidents of agricultural and industrial work, and it continued to appear in apothecary handbooks long after formal medicine had moved to other approaches for shock management, because people who had used it knew that it worked. The milfoil conserve that appears in apothecary ledgers from the 1600s is different again. A conserve was made by combining the plant with sugar, or honey, producing something between a medicine and a preserved food, palatable enough to be taken regularly over extended periods, sold for stomach fluxes, for the persistent digestive complaints that responded to Yarrow's bitter and antispasmodic properties, taken consistently over time rather than in a single dose. Sugar was expensive in the 1600s. A milfoil conserve was not a cheap remedy, and an apothecary making it in quantity was committing real resources to a preparation they expected to sell. The fact that it appears regularly in the ledgers that it was a standard stock item rather than an occasional special preparation tells us that demand for it was consistent. People were buying it repeatedly. It was working well enough and reliably enough that they came back. That is the most honest measure of any apothecary preparation across any century, not the elegance of the theory behind it, not the authority of the physician who recommended it, whether people kept returning for more. For Yarrow, in form after form, preparation after preparation across centuries of recorded apothecary practice, they did. I know this not only from the ledgers and the handbooks, I know it from a lifetime spent making these preparations myself, from the first simple infusions of my apprenticeship to the more complex distillations and conserves of later years, the smell of Yarrow drying in the workroom, the color of a well-made oil held up to the light, the particular satisfaction of a salve that sets cleanly in the pot and smells exactly as it should. A plant that has been prepared well by someone who understands what they are working with has a quality to it that is difficult to describe precisely, but not difficult to recognize. Yarrow, prepared with care, has that quality. It has always had it. There is a difference between a physician's herb and a household herb. A physician's herb is the one that appears in the learned texts, prescribed by trained practitioners, prepared with specialist knowledge, administered in measured doses under professional supervision. These herbs are respected, sometimes feared a little, kept behind the counter or in the locked cabinet where only those with the relevant training have access to them. A household herb is something else entirely. It is the one that sits in the kitchen or hangs drying in the back room or grows just outside the door where it can be reached quickly without ceremony or preparation. It does not require a physician to authorize its use. It does not require specialist equipment to prepare. It is simply known by the women of the house and the older members of the family and the neighbors who have been using it long enough to trust it without needing anyone to explain why, passed down not through formal education, but through daily life, through watching and being shown and remembering. Yarrow is both that is unusual. Most plants settle into one category or the other over time. The ones that require careful preparation or carry risks in the wrong dose tend toward the physician's cabinet. The ones with gentler, more forgiving profiles tend toward the household. Yarrow refused to be contained by either category and was claimed by both simultaneously. The learned herbalists wrote about it with professional seriousness. The physicians prescribed it in formal practice. And at the same time, in every village and farmstead and urban tenement where it was available, ordinary people were reaching for it without any professional instruction whatsoever, because they had been shown how by the person who raised them, who had been shown by the person who raised them, in an unbroken chain of domestic knowledge, stretching back further than any written record. That dual status is itself a testament to the plant, to be trusted by both the physician and the household, without either tradition undermining the other's confidence in it, is not something that happens by accident. It happens because the plant earns both trusts consistently over a very long time. Let us begin where most households began, which is with fever. Fever was the great common enemy of pre-modern domestic life, not the dramatic fevers of plague or battlefield infection, which required more than household medicine could address, but the ordinary fevers of winter, the cold that turned into something more serious in the chest of an elderly grandparent, the influenza that moved through a household one person at a time across the dark months, the child who woke in the night hot and shivering and needed something to be done before morning. In those moments, Yarrow was the thing that was done. A hot infusion, drunk as quickly as it could be comfortably tolerated, induced sweating, and sweating, in the traditional understanding of fever management that prevailed across European domestic medicine for centuries, was the mechanism by which a fever broke. The body needed to push the heat out through the skin. It needed help doing this efficiently. A diaphotic herb, one that promoted perspiration and opened the channels through which the body expelled excess heat, was therefore a fever herb in the most direct and practical sense. It helped the body do what it was already trying to do, more completely and more efficiently than it could manage alone. We understand the physiology of fever somewhat differently now. The mechanisms we describe have more precision than the older explanations, but the observation that Yarrow promoted sweating was correct. The observation that patients given hot Yarrow infusions during fevers often improved and recovered more quickly was also correct. The mechanism that traditional practitioners identified was not wrong in its essentials. It was simply incomplete in ways they had no means to complete, working with the tools and the vocabulary their era provided. The standard domestic preparation was simple and consistent across most of European folk practice. Fresh or dried Yarrow, steeped in water that had just come off the boil, covered to trap the volatile steam, left for 10 minutes, drunk hot, in bed, with enough blankets to encourage the sweating that would follow. A second cup if the fever was stubborn, a third if necessary. The vapor bath extended this principle into a more immersive form. Yarrow added to a vessel of steaming water, the patient seated over it with a cloth or blanket draped over both head and vessel to trap the steam, inhaling the volatile oils directly into the respiratory passages, while the rising heat opened the pores and encouraged the perspiration from the outside. The two approaches, the internal tea and the external steam, worked together, one pushing through the blood and the digestive system, the other working directly on the skin and the airways. Traditional herbalists sold medicated vapor bath preparations alongside the internal teas as a combined treatment for stubborn fevers. Australian herbalists of the 19th century, working with the European tradition that had been transplanted and adapted to the southern hemisphere, made particular note of Yarrow's value as a bitter and a medicated vapor bath for fevers of the intermittent kind. Intermittent fevers, the ones that came and went in regular patterns rather than persisting continuously, were among the most troubling, at least understood. They are now associated with certain parasitic infections, but the observation that Yarrow addressed them, whatever the underlying mechanism, appears consistently enough across the historical record to be taken seriously as an empirical finding. The plague waters belong to the darker and more desperate end of Yarrow's fever history, and they deserve their own consideration. During the periodic epidemic diseases that moved through European cities and towns, the domestic response included preparations intended to protect the air itself. The theory of miasma, the belief that disease was carried in corrupt or poisoned air, was wrong in its specific mechanism, but not entirely wrong in its broader implications. Contaminated environments were genuinely dangerous. Crowded, poorly ventilated spaces with inadequate sanitation created conditions in which disease spread readily. The instinct to purify the air of a sick room was not irrational, even though the theory behind it was incomplete. Yarrow appeared in plague waters, distilled alongside rosemary and rue, producing a strongly aromatic preparation that was believed to purify the air and protect those who carried or burned it nearby. In Scotland, bundles of dried yarrow were burned to fumigate sick rooms during epidemics, the smoke filling the space and being understood to drive away the miasma that carried illness from the sick to the well. The antimicrobial properties of yarrow smoke are real. They are not sufficient to address epidemic disease at the scale that devastated early modern European populations. But they were not nothing either. In the context of a household, trying to protect itself with what it had, burning yarrow in a sick room, was the best available application of a genuine property of the plant, stretched beyond what that property could fully achieve by the scale of the need. People in desperate circumstances do what they can with what they have. What they had across much of European history included yarrow, and yarrow was brought to bear on everything, including the things that were beyond what any single plant could address. Beyond fevers, the respiratory applications of yarrow in everyday household medicine were extensive and varied in their methods. Hot yarrow tea for colds, coughs, and sore throats was the baseline, the preparation that every household knew and almost every household kept the material for. The diaphoretic action cleared congestion by moving fluid through the skin. The mild diuretic action moved excess fluid through the kidneys. The anti-inflammatory action reduced the swelling of the irritated mucous membranes that made breathing uncomfortable and swallowing painful. For headache and nasal congestion, some European and colonial American traditions adopted the delivery method we encountered in the indigenous North American record and adapted it into a domestic practice. Dried yarrow, powdered very finely and used as snuff, inhaled directly into the nasal passages, where the volatile oils and astringent compounds could work on the congested tissue from the inside. This is not a preparation for the faint of nose, and the initial effect of inhaling yarrow snuff is not particularly pleasant. But the resulting clearance of congested passages was rapid, and by the accounts of those who used it, effective. Colonial American practice adopted this use and developed it further, sometimes incorporating yarrow into tobacco blends intended for smoking. The aromatic properties of the plant, combining with the tobacco into a preparation that addressed the respiratory symptoms of cold season, while delivering the nicotine that many users had come to depend upon for other reasons. Victorian European households made similar combinations. These are not preparations modern medicine would recommend without serious qualification, but they represent a consistent and logically coherent extension of yarrow's well-documented respiratory properties into the delivery methods their era had available. The yarrow-infused honey addressed the throat and the chest from a different direction entirely. Honey itself was understood as demulcent and soothing to inflamed mucous membranes, coating the irritated surfaces of the throat and reducing the raw scraped sensation of a persistent cough. Yarrow infused into the honey brought its antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties into a form that was palatable enough to be taken repeatedly, sweet enough for children who would refuse the plain bitter tea, and stable enough to keep through the winter months without spoiling. Folk apothecaries prepared it specifically for sore throats, but it found its way into broader use for anything requiring gentle, sustained, soothing intervention that could be administered repeatedly without resistance from the patient. A preparation that a child will take willingly has a considerable practical advantage over one that requires determination on both sides. The Victorian electuary carried this principle further. A herbal paste made by combining yarrow with honey and spices worked into a thick consistency that could be taken in small doses on a spoon and held in the mouth before swallowing, releasing the yarrow compounds slowly into the throat and upper respiratory tract as it dissolved. Prepared specifically for chronic coughs and the persistent catarrh that settled into the chests of people who lived through long winters in cold, damp, poorly ventilated buildings. The electuary was not a quick fix. It was a sustained intervention, taken regularly over weeks, addressed to a condition that had established itself and needed consistent attention to dislodge. Now to the digestive applications, which formed perhaps the largest single category of yarrow's household use, and the one most embedded in the ordinary daily rhythm of domestic life. The bitters in yarrow stimulate appetite and assist the digestion of fat. This sounds modest taken in isolation, but in a historical context where a significant portion of the diet was fat from animal sources, and where digestive failure in the winter months could mean genuine malnutrition in a household already under nutritional stress, a reliable bitter digestive herb was not a luxury. It was a practical necessity for families whose members regularly suffered the flatulence, cramping, bloating, and general sluggishness of a digestive system struggling to process a heavy diet without adequate support. Yarrow tea taken before or after a heavy meal was a standard domestic practice across much of Europe and the colonial world. Not medicine in the formal sense. Simply part of the rhythm of eating well and helping the body do what the meal required of it. The kind of practice that rarely appears in official herbals precisely because it is too ordinary to record, but that persists for centuries in daily life because it performs its modest function reliably every time it is applied. For more serious digestive complaints, the preparations became more deliberate and the dosing more careful. Stomach cramps responded to the antispasmodic properties of the volatile oils, the same compounds that addressed menstrual cramping and the convulsive spasms of other conditions. Flatulence responded to the bitter stimulation of digestive secretions that improved the processing of food further up the system, reducing the fermentation that produced the gas in the first place. Weak digestion, the persistent inability of the system to extract adequate nutrition from what was eaten, responded to regular bitter stimulation that gradually improved the function of the organs involved. The milfoil conserve, the sugared preparation sold by apothecaries in the 1600s for stomach fluxes, was the formalized commercial version of what the household was doing informally with a cup of tea. The apothecary had simply made it more concentrated, more stable, more convenient, and more expensive. Let us turn now to the women's health applications, which deserve their own careful and unhurried attention. We have encountered Yarrow's gynecological applications many times in the course of this night. Dioscorides in the 1st century, describing a specific preparation for uterine hemorrhage. Hildegard von Bingen in the 12th century, using it to regulate and support the menstrual cycle. The Ayurvedic tradition, identifying it as a pitta, balancing uterine tonic, the Cheyenne and Navajo, using it for menstrual discomfort independently of all of these. Each tradition working without reference to the others, arriving at the same observation about the same plant. By the 19th century, this accumulated weight of independent observation had entered official medicine in the United States in a formal way. Yarrow was listed in the United States Pharmacopoeia specifically to promote menstruation and support related gynecological issues. A pharmacopoeia is not a folk herbal or a traditional healer's handbook. It is the official register of medicines considered proven and useful enough to be formally recognized by the medical establishment of the time. Yarrow's inclusion in it for gynecological use represents the point at which centuries of independent traditional observation crossed the threshold into official acknowledgement. The patent medicine trade of the same era was less careful and considerably less transparent. Yarrow appeared in proprietary preparations marketed under names like female regulator, sold for delayed menses and the complaints that the Victorian era gathered under the broad and vague category of female troubles. These preparations were often combined with pennyroyal and other herbs with stronger emmenagogue effects, sold with implications that the manufacturers understood clearly even if they did not state them plainly. The household use was more straightforward than either the official pharmacopoeia or the commercial patent medicine. Yarrow infusion for menstrual cramps, taken warm in the days when cramping was worst. Yarrow for excessive bleeding, where the astringent and styptic properties addressed the flow directly. Yarrow for delayed or absent cycles, where its gentle emmenagogue effects encouraged what the body seemed to be withholding. The amphoteric quality described by Maud Grieve, acting either way on blood flow, made Yarrow particularly suitable for menstrual complaints, precisely because those complaints presented in both directions, too much or too little, too much cramping or a complete absence of cycle. The plant that could stop bleeding externally and encourage it internally was ideally positioned to address a system whose dysfunction manifested across a spectrum rather than in a single predictable direction. This is why Yarrow appears so consistently in women's health traditions across so many cultures. It was not one of the plants that addressed only a single aspect of reproductive function. It was one of the regulatory plants, the ones that worked with the body's own tendency toward balance, rather than simply overriding it in one direction. Households knew this from experience, across generations of women passing the knowledge to the daughters who would need it. The formal medical establishment eventually caught up and wrote it into the pharmacopoeia. But the household knowledge came first, as it so often did. The skin applications of Yarrow in household practice were extensive and long-lived. Standard ointments for chronic wounds and persistent skin complaints, made by macerating the herb and working it carefully into a salve base, were kept in most well-stocked household medicine stores. Poultices and washes for rashes and itching skin applied the same anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial properties that made Yarrow useful for wounds to the slower, less dramatic skin conditions that persisted through weeks and months rather than resolving in days. Eczema and the chronic inflammatory skin conditions that have been part of human experience in every era responded to Yarrow preparations applied consistently over time. Not always cured, but managed, reduced in severity, made more tolerable by the regular application of something that addressed both the inflammation and the secondary infections that complicated these conditions and prevented their resolution. The eye wash occupied a specialized position in the household's use of Yarrow, requiring more care in preparation than almost any other application. A cooled Yarrow decoction, strained with patience and considerable thoroughness, to remove every trace of plant material that might cause irritation to the delicate tissue of the eye, was used to bathe inflamed eyes. Conjunctivitis, dyes, the persistent redness and discomfort of eyes exposed to wood smoke and dust and the strain of working in poor light. The antimicrobial properties address the bacterial component of these conditions. The anti-inflammatory compounds reduce the swelling and heat. The straining was not optional. A Yarrow eye wash prepared carelessly, retaining fine particles of leaf or stem in the solution, caused irritation and made the condition worse rather than better. This was a preparation that made the difference between effective and harmful in its execution. Experienced household healers and apothecaries knew this and said so clearly when passing the knowledge on. Oral health applications were similarly specific in their requirements and similarly effective when properly prepared. Ground yarrow root, incorporated into tooth powder, was used for bleeding gums and the slow recession and infection that preceded tooth loss in populations with no access to professional dental care. The tannins contracted inflamed gum tissue and reduced bleeding. The antimicrobial compounds worked on the bacterial infection that drove the underlying condition. The tooth powder addressed both simultaneously with every application. Yarrow infusion, used as a mouthwash, brought the same properties to the same tissues in a less abrasive form, holding the preparation in contact with the inflamed gums long enough to allow both the astringent and antimicrobial effects to act. Apothecaries who prepared both the powder and the mouthwash often recommended them together, understanding that the mechanical and the medicinal approaches to the same problem complemented each other in ways that neither achieved alone. The hair and scalp applications sit at the boundary between medicine and what a later era would call cosmetic care, though that distinction would have been meaningless in most historical households, where the health of the hair and scalp was simply part of the health of the body and addressed with the same practical attention. Victorian apothecaries prepared yarrow hair rinses, mixed with vinegar as a standard stock item. The vinegar sealed the hair shaft and added a visible shine that customers appreciated and that encouraged repeat purchase. The yarrow improved circulation to the scalp, which the traditional understanding associated with healthier and more vigorous hair. Whether the preparation achieved everything it was claimed to achieve in terms of darkening graying hair is a question the evidence answers only partially. What it certainly achieved was the reliable improvement of scalp circulation through the act of regular application, which supported the health of the follicles in ways that were real, even if not fully understood by the practitioners recommending the preparation. The scalp rinse combining yarrow with nettle and rosemary was more specifically directed at thinning hair and the early stages of hair loss. All three plants carried reputations for improving scalp circulation and supporting follicle health. Applied regularly and worked carefully into the scalp, the combination addressed the circulatory component of hair loss that was genuinely within the reach of botanical intervention. Weekly application over months, persistence through the slow pace of hair growth, the patience that traditional medicine required, and that modern instant remedies have made unfashionable. I want to pause here and note something from the Russian folk tradition that stands somewhat apart from everything else we have covered in this section. Traditional Russian practice used yarrow for epilepsy as a sedative tea prepared specifically to calm the convulsions that accompanied seizures. This application is striking in its specificity and its distance from the wound and bleeding tradition that forms the backbone of yarrow's history. Epilepsy was not well understood before the modern era, was frequently associated with spiritual or supernatural explanations, and was treated across different traditions with a wide variety of preparations. But the appearance of yarrow in the Russian record for this purpose is not arbitrary. The antispasmodic properties of the volatile oils, which we have encountered repeatedly in the contexts of digestive cramping and menstrual pain and respiratory spasm, are relevant to convulsive conditions through the same general mechanism. A plant that reduces involuntary muscular spasm in one context may do the same in another. Whether yarrow tea was genuinely effective for epilepsy in the clinical sense, modern medicine would require to acknowledge. It is not something the historical record can establish with certainty. But the logic connecting its antispasmodic properties to a convulsive condition is coherent and honest. The Russian practitioners were applying what they knew about the plant to a condition whose mechanism, though they could not have described it in modern terms, shared something with the conditions they had already successfully treated. Finally, and I think this deserves its place at the end of this section rather than being passed over quickly, the veterinary applications of yarrow tell us something important about how completely it was integrated into the life of a household. Traditional veterinary apothecaries used yarrow poultices on livestock wounds and abscesses, the same styptic and antimicrobial properties that serve human patients serve the animals on which the household survival and prosperity directly depended. A cow with a wound that turned septic was not merely an unfortunate animal. It was a serious economic crisis for a family whose margin between adequacy and hardship was often very narrow. A preparation that reliably reduced the risk of sepsis in animal wounds was therefore a practical economic tool as much as a medical one. 17th century English husbandry texts went further, recommending yarrow as fodder for sheep and cattle to improve their digestion and help expel intestinal worms. The bitter compounds that stimulated human digestion did the same for livestock. The antispasmodic properties that settled human guts settled animal guts as well, and the antiparasitic effects of yarrow compounds, which would eventually attract the attention of modern researchers, were apparently observed empirically by husbandry practitioners who noted that animals grazing regularly on yarrow, rich pasture carried fewer internal parasites and maintained their condition better through the winter months. A plant trusted with human health, trusted with the health of the animals on which the household depended, present in the medicine chest and the kitchen and the pasture simultaneously. That is the fullest possible integration into the life of a community, not a specialist remedy kept for particular conditions and particular patients, a constant presence woven into the daily fabric of life at every level. Yarrow achieved that integration everywhere it grew, in every era that paid attention to it. It was not one thing in the apothecary's dispensary, and another thing in the farmwife's kitchen, and another thing again in the husbandman's field. It was the same plant, doing what it did, asked about everything and refusing very little. The household trusted it for that reason. Across all the centuries we have covered tonight, the household was right too. There is a version of botanical history that lives in the learned texts. In the herbals, the pharmacopoeias, the physician's notebooks, and the apothecary's ledgers. That version is valuable. It gives us dates and names and the formal record of how knowledge was transmitted through the institutions of medicine across the centuries. It is the version most often cited, most often studied, most often considered authoritative. But there is another version that lives somewhere else entirely in the recipes passed between neighbors over a fence or across a market stall, in the proportions memorized by women who could not read and did not need to. In the specific weight of dried yarrow that a particular household had learned, through trial and careful adjustment over generations, produced the tea that worked best for their children's winter fevers. In the brewing traditions of communities who had been adding yarrow to their ale since before anyone thought to write down why. That version is harder to recover. It left fewer records, and the records it did leave are scattered across household books and regional surveys, and the notes of botanists who happened to ask the right questions of the right people at the right moment. But it is not entirely gone, and what survives of it tells us things about yarrow that the formal texts do not, because it preserves the texture of how the plant actually lived inside the daily life of ordinary people, rather than how it was theorized about by the learned. Let us begin with the recipes, the actual ones, with quantities and methods and the names that households gave to their preparations. The fever tea that appears across the traditional household record had a standard form that varied in regional detail but was consistent in its essential structure. 2 ounces of dried yarrow, simmered in 2 pints of water for 20 minutes, the vessel covered throughout to trap the volatile steam, sweetened at the end with honey to make it palatable. Drunk hot in bed with enough covering to encourage the sweating that the yarrow would promote. Every element of this recipe carries specific reasoning behind it. The simmering rather than steeping is the first thing to notice. 20 minutes of sustained gentle heat extracts more of the tannins and the heavier compounds than a simple steep in hot water would deliver. It produces a stronger, darker preparation, more bitter, more concentrated, more fully representative of everything the plant contains. For a fever tea intended to do serious work on a patient who was genuinely unwell, the simmered preparation was the one that household tradition settled on through the accumulated experience of what actually produced results. The honey at the end was not added as an afterthought. It was understood as part of the preparation's action. Honey coated the throat, extending the preparation's benefits beyond the stomach into the mucous membranes it contacted on the way down. It added its own mild antimicrobial properties to those of the yarrow, and it made the medicine something the patient would accept readily rather than resist, which in the case of children and the very elderly was not a trivial consideration. A medicine refused is a medicine that does nothing. The covering in bed completed the preparation's mechanism. The yarrow had promoted the body's tendency towards sweating. The blankets created the warm enclosed environment in which that sweating could do its full work. The recipe understood the patient's body as part of the preparation, not simply as the passive recipient of it. The combination fever tea extended this logic by adding 2 more plants to yarrow's foundation. The blend of elderflower, peppermint, and yarrow, known in some traditions by the shorthand of its 3 initials, appears in the household record as one of the most consistently recommended preparations for the ordinary fevers of winter. Each component contributed something specific that the others could not fully replace. Elderflower brought its own diaphytic action and a gentle sweetness that softened the bitterness of the other 2, making the blend more acceptable. Peppermint added its cooling, volatile oils. The menthol compounds that created the sensation of opened airways and reduced the discomfort of congested nasal passages. Yarrow provided the sustained foundation, the anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial properties that underpinned the whole preparation and continued working after the more volatile effects of the peppermint had faded. Together they addressed a fever from 3 directions at once. The combination producing results that made it one of the most enduring preparations in the domestic herbal tradition, still recommended by herbalists today, in essentially the same proportions it has always been made in. The flu preparation took the principle further into more serious territory and more deliberate dosing. Yarrow simmered with elderberries, the elderberries adding their well-documented antiviral and immune-supporting properties to yarrow's anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial base. The whole sweetened with honey or molasses and administered at 4 tablespoons 4 times daily, at regular intervals throughout the day. That dosing schedule is worth pausing on. 4 times daily at regular intervals is not casual medicine. It is a considered protocol designed to maintain a consistent level of the preparation's active compounds in the patient's body rather than delivering a large dose infrequently and allowing the effect to fade between administrations. The household practitioner who developed and passed on this schedule was thinking in terms that a modern pharmacist would recognize, even though the vocabulary and the theoretical framework were entirely different. This is what genuine accumulated domestic knowledge looks like at its best. Not vague tradition, not inherited belief applied without reflection, but tested practice refined over generations into something with the precision of a clinical protocol expressed in the language of a kitchen. Early American colonists carried the European domestic tradition across the ocean and adapted it to the conditions and the materials of the New World. They chewed fresh yarrow leaves, as people had been chewing them since before recorded history, for upset stomachs and for the regulation of menstrual flow and for fevers and chills. The simplest and most immediate form of the plant's use, requiring nothing between the person and the plant, except the willingness to reach down and pick it. They also developed the chest rub, a preparation that does not appear prominently in the European record before the colonial period, and that represents a genuinely American adaptation of the plant's respiratory properties into a new delivery method. Yarrow flowers infused into a carrier oil. The resulting preparation rubbed firmly into the chest and throat of a patient lying in bed. The warmth of the body and the covering of blankets created a kind of extended personal vapor bath, the volatile oils evaporating from the skin upward into the face and airways of the person beneath the bedclothes, the aromatic compounds doing their decongesting work through continuous inhalation over the hours of rest. This is the domestic predecessor of the camphorated chest rubs that would eventually become standard commercial products sold in every pharmacy. The mechanism is identical, the principle is identical, the practical application is identical. What changed? Over the generations between the colonial household making yarrow flower chest rubs and the modern consumer buying a manufactured equivalent was the source of the preparation and the name on the tin. The underlying understanding of how to deliver aromatic compounds to congested airways through the skin of the chest remained exactly the same. The salve recipe that sat alongside these liquid and topical preparations in the household tradition carried the same specific proportions that spoke of genuine craft knowledge rather than approximate tradition. Fresh yarrow flowers and leaves packed into a vessel, covered generously in a good carrier oil, left to macerate at a gentle warmth for several weeks, then strained carefully and returned to heat for combination with beeswax. The ratio of wax to oil was the piece of knowledge that separated a useful salve from a frustrating one, and the household tradition preserved it with the same specificity. It preserved the simmering time of the fever tea. Too much wax in the salve was hard and unyielding, difficult to work into the skin, sitting on the surface rather than penetrating to where the preparation needed to go. Too little wax and the salve softened at skin temperature and ran, refusing to stay where it was placed on a wound or an inflamed joint. The right proportion, roughly an ounce of beeswax to a cup and a quarter of infused oil, produced something that softened under the warmth of a finger, spread smoothly into the skin, and held its form in the pot at room temperature until the next application was needed. This is the kind of knowledge that is arrived at by making a preparation many times, adjusting after each batch, remembering what worked and what did not, and eventually arriving at a specific figure that reliably produces the right result. It is craft knowledge, and the domestic tradition preserved it with the same fidelity that a guild preserved the technical knowledge of a skilled trade. Now let us move entirely out of the medicine cabinet and into the brewing tradition, because Yarrow's role there is considerable and is often reduced to a footnote in its history when it deserves considerably more attention. Before hops became the standard bittering and preserving agent for beer across most of Europe, brewers used other plants, The herbal mixture used to flavor and preserve ale in the medieval period was called grut, and it was a matter of significant regional variation, and in some places considerable economic and political importance. The rights to supply grut to the brewers of a region could be a lucrative monopoly held by the church or the local nobility, and the composition of the mixture varied from one area to another, depending on what the grut holder chose to include. Yarrow was among the most widely and consistently used grut ingredients across the regions where it grew. Its bitter compounds gave the ale the edge that balanced the sweetness of the malt, the same way hops would later do. Its antimicrobial properties reduced the growth of organisms that would spoil the brew between production and consumption, extending the ale's useful life in an era without refrigeration or sealed containers. A plant that made your ale taste better and last longer was not a minor convenience. It was a practical economic benefit. The difference between a batch that kept through the week and one that turned before it could be consumed. Yarrow did both things from the same properties that made it valuable in the medicine chest. The brewer and the apothecary were drawing on the same plant for reasons that, beneath their different surfaces, were not actually so different. Both were exploiting the antimicrobial character of Yarrow's volatile oils. Both were using its bitter compounds for their specific effects. The context was different. The plant was the same. Carl Linnaeus, recording his observations of the Dalecarlian people of Sweden in the 18th century, noted that they continued to infuse yarrow into their beer for both flavor and medicinal effect, long after hops had become the standard bittering agent across most of the rest of Europe. The Dalecarlian practice was not the survival of ignorance or the persistence of a tradition too stubborn to update itself. It was the continuation of something the people who maintained it clearly valued, either for the specific character of the flavor yarrow produced, which differed from hops in ways they apparently preferred, or for the medicinal properties the yarrow brought into the drink, alongside its bitterness, or for both simultaneously. The Nordic brewing tradition used yarrow as a hop substitute more broadly than the Swedish record alone would suggest. The bitterness and the preservation working through the same mechanisms as in the grut tradition. In Germany and Switzerland, yarrow seeds were added specifically to wine for preservation, and for the distinctive flavor, the seeds contributed to the finished drink. This practice is documented in regional production records long after yarrow had been displaced from mainstream brewing by the hop, suggesting that in the wine tradition it occupied a different and more specific role that the hop did not replicate. There was a belief attached to the yarrow ale tradition that is worth recording with appropriate care. Brewers and those who drank their product noted, and the observation was recorded in the brewing literature, that ale made with yarrow rather than hops produced a stronger intoxicating effect than ale made with other bittering agents. Whether this was pharmacologically accurate, whether the compounds in yarrow genuinely enhanced the effects of the alcohol, or whether it reflected the presence of other grut herbs in the mixture whose psychoactive character was being attributed to the yarrow, or whether it was simply the compelling story that a brew with a more complex and mysterious ingredient tends to acquire, is not straightforwardly answerable from the historical record. What is certain is that the belief was widespread enough to be recorded, and that it added a dimension to yarrow's place in the brewing tradition that went beyond purely practical considerations of bitterness and preservation. A drink made with a plant already associated with ritual and protection, believed to intensify its effects, occupied a different cultural space than a simple bittering agent. It sat at the place where the domestic and the ceremonial touched each other, as yarrow so often did. The medieval household did not only consume yarrow in its drinks, it lived with it underfoot. Strewing herbs were scattered across the stone and earthen floors of homes and churches throughout the medieval and early modern period. The practice served several purposes at once, none of them separable from the others in the minds of the people who maintained it. The aromatic oils released when the herbs were walked upon addressed the persistent problem of indoor odor in a world without effective waste management, where the floor of a living space absorbed everything that fell onto it over months and years of occupation. The antimicrobial properties of aromatic herbs reduced, in some real if limited degree, The microbial load of an environment where illness moved freely between people living in close and inadequately ventilated proximity. And the herbs created a sensory quality of freshness and order in spaces that could become oppressive and stale through the dark months of closed windows and crowded rooms. Yarrow was among the most commonly used brewing herbs, and its use on church floors alongside domestic floors connects the plant once again to the boundary between the practical and the sacred. The same preparation that freshened a household floor was considered appropriate for the floor of a place of worship, which tells us something about how yarrow was regarded. It was not a plant associated only with the rough practical work of wounds and fevers. It carried a quality that made it suitable for the most significant spaces in a community's life. The agrarian applications extend the picture of yarrow's integration into daily life in directions that have nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with the management of land and growing things. As a companion plant, yarrow's effects on the garden ecology around it were noted by practical gardeners long before any ecological framework existed to explain what they were observing. Plants growing near established yarrow patches appeared healthier, and more vigorous pest pressure seemed reduced. The insects present in a yarrow-rich garden included more of the beneficial predatory species that kept other pest populations in check. The gardener who placed yarrow deliberately among their other plants and recorded that the garden did better for its presence was making an accurate empirical observation, whatever vocabulary they used to describe what they saw. As a soil stabilizer, yarrow's rhizomatous growth habit made it practically useful for holding ground that human activity had disturbed. Its spreading underground stems created a persistent root mat that resisted erosion from rain and wind, and that created the stable conditions in which other plants could establish themselves. A bank that was crumbling, a path edge that was washing away, a recently dug area that needed to be held while something more permanent established itself. Yarrow planted into these situations spread, held, and remained. This same rhizomatous persistence is what made it so reliably available to households that had once established it nearby. It did not need to be replanted each season. It did not need particular attention or cultivation. It needed only to be allowed to remain, and it would be there at the edge of the kitchen garden or the field margin year after year, available for harvesting whenever it was needed, replenishing itself from below ground through the winters that killed its aerial parts and sent them back in the spring as if they had never been absent. Seed historians who have studied yarrow's ecological relationship with human settlement describe this quality as one of the keys to understanding its extraordinary persistence in the human botanical record. It was not merely a useful plant. It was a plant that made itself available to the people who found it useful, establishing itself near dwellings and returning reliably, making the investment of attention required to learn it thoroughly worthwhile, in a way that a plant requiring active cultivation might not have been for households already burdened with the labor of maintaining everything else they depended on. The concept of the single herb remedy deployable without specialist knowledge or equipment was central to the ideal of domestic botanical medicine as it was understood in the early modern period. The good simple was reliable, accessible, broadly applicable, and consistent enough in its effects that ordinary people could use it with confidence. It embodied the ideal of the self-reliant household healer. The person who could manage the ordinary medical needs of a family without depending on access to professional care that might be distant, expensive, or simply unavailable at the moment it was most needed. Historical texts praised yarrow as among the finest simples available to the European household, a plant that could be gathered freely from roadsides and field margins wherever one lived, that dried readily and stored well through the seasons when fresh material was unavailable, that could be prepared as a tea or a poultice or a salve or a compress with nothing beyond the equipment found in any kitchen, that addressed the most common and the most serious household medical needs with a reliability tested by generations of ordinary people in ordinary circumstances. That is a complete description of what a simple should be, and yarrow met every part of it. Which is why, when you examine the full span of yarrow's history, from the Neanderthal grave to the colonial chest rub, to the medieval brewing vat to the Victorian hair rinse, what you find is not a plant that was used for many different things by many different people. What you find is a plant that was woven into the texture of daily human life so thoroughly, and held its place in that texture so consistently across so many centuries and so many cultures, that the question is not why it was used for so many things, but how any community that knew it could have managed without it. The household that had yarrow at the edge of its garden, yarrow drying in its back room, yarrow in the ale and on the floor and in the medicine chest and in the pasture, where the cattle grazed, was not a household that had made an unusual commitment to a single plant. It was simply a household that was paying attention. We have not yet spoken directly about why we are out here at this hour. Not the practical reason. The practical reason is simple enough. Vervain harvested at night under specific conditions, in accordance with a tradition older than any of the herbals on my shelves. That is what brought us to this field when the rest of the village is long asleep. The dew still on the grass and the stars doing what stars do when no one is watching them particularly. But there is a deeper reason behind the practical one, and it connects to a current of belief and practice that has run alongside the medical history we have been tracing all evening. The belief that certain plants, gathered at certain times, in certain ways by people who understood what they were asking of the plant, carried something beyond their measurable properties, something that the daylight and the ordinary harvest and the clinical preparation could not fully capture. Yarrow belongs to that current as completely as it belongs to the medical tradition. Perhaps more completely, if we are honest about the chronology, the pollen in the Neanderthal grave predates any written pharmacopoeia by 55,000 years. Whatever those people understood about yarrow, it was not primarily a clinical understanding. It was something older and less easily named, something that lived in the relationship between a community and a plant that seemed to operate at the edges of ordinary life, at the moments when ordinary life was not sufficient for what was required. Let us follow that thread now. With the same attention, we have given everything else tonight. The names first, because the names are always the first record of how a community understood something. And yarrow's magical names are as revealing as its medical ones. We have already encountered the honorable names: the healer, the herb of 7 cures, life medicine, soldier's woundwort, knight's milfoil, names that speak of trust and proven usefulness, given by people who respected the plant and wanted that respect preserved in what they called it across the generations. But yarrow also accumulated names of an entirely different character. Devil's nettle, devil's plaything, bad, man's plaything. These require some careful unpacking, because the instinct is to read them as expressions of fear or condemnation. And that is not quite what they represent. In the folk tradition of early modern Europe, plants associated with the devil were not necessarily considered harmful or malevolent in themselves. They were associated with power that exceeded ordinary understanding, power that operated beyond the boundaries of what the church and the formal institutions could fully sanction or explain. The devil, in this folk cosmology, was not only a figure of evil, but a figure of knowledge that the official world wanted to keep suppressed, a keeper of the things the approved framework preferred not to acknowledge. A plant, called the devil's plaything, was a plant that did things people could not account for within the approved framework. A plant that appeared regularly in the work of cunning men and cunning women. A plant that was useful in ways the physician's handbook did not describe and the priest's calendar did not sanction. A plant that knew more than it was supposed to know, and that shared what it knew with those who asked properly. Yarrow earned these names because it appeared in spellcraft and divination so consistently and so widely that the association became inseparable from its identity. Maud Grieve, not a woman given to unnecessary drama in her botanical writing, stated it plainly. Yarrow was widely used in earlier times for spells and charms. She wrote it as a plain fact, without apology or qualification, because it was a plain fact that any honest account of the plant had to include. And at precisely the same time, from the same period, a 19th century source claimed yarrow as the first herb our Saviour put in his hand when he was a child, endowing it with Christian protective virtue of the most unambiguous kind. The Devil's Plaything and the Christ Child's Herb, both names circulating simultaneously among people who apparently saw no great contradiction in holding both, because both were expressing the same underlying understanding. Yarrow was a plant of power. Where that power originated was a matter of theological interpretation. That the power was real was not in question by either side. This double identity, sanctioned and unsanctioned, medical and magical, Christian and pre-Christian, is one of the most consistent features of Yarrow's place in European culture. It sat on the boundary between what was approved and what was not, and it was claimed by both sides and condemned by neither with any great conviction, because it was too well established and too genuinely useful to displace. The witchcraft trial records of early modern Europe contain Yarrow. In the language of the trials, it appeared most often as milfoil, its Latinate common name, listed in the testimonies of accused individuals as an ingredient in magical or malefic mixtures. We should be careful about what we read from these records, since the framework of the trials was designed to produce confessions that confirmed the expectations of the prosecutors rather than accurate botanical documentation. But the consistency with which Yarrow appears across different trials in different countries over more than 2 centuries confirms that it was a genuine and widespread component of the folk magical practice that the trials were attempting to eliminate. The Scottish case of Elspeth Rioch, tried in 1616, is among the most precise and most extraordinary of these records. Rioch described the gathering of what she called melafor, a dialectal rendering of milfoil with a specificity that goes far beyond the usual vague testimony of the trial records. She gathered it kneeling on her right knee. She pulled it using her thumb and middle finger, specifically not the whole hand, and as she did so, she recited the formula in nomen patris, Filii et Spiritus Sancti, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Pause on this for a moment. This is not a picture of diabolical practice. It is a picture of folk practice that had absorbed the language and the formal gestures of Christianity into a much older tradition of prescribed herb gathering, the kneeling, the specific fingers, the Latin invocation. Each element deliberate, each element carrying significance, within a system of practice that understood the manner of gathering as inseparable from what the gathered plant could do. The right knee, not the left. The thumb and middle finger, not the index. The words spoken precisely as they had been passed down, not improvised. This is craft. This is knowledge transmitted with the same care and specificity as the proportions of the fever tea, or the ratio of beeswax to oil in the salve recipe. The form of the gathering was as important as the gathering itself. Rioch claimed that gathering yarrow in this way gave her powers of healing and prediction. The trial record preserves her words as evidence of witchcraft. We might read them differently, as the testimony of a woman who had received and maintained a genuine tradition of botanical practice, who understood that the relationship between the gatherer and the plant was shaped by the quality and the form of the attention brought to it, and who was describing that understanding in the only vocabulary available to her. She was not the only one who understood this. The prescribed gathering traditions for yarrow appear across the European record with remarkable consistency in places that had no obvious direct contact with one another. In Ireland, yarrow was gathered with set verses recited. As the plant was cut, the words were not a casual accompaniment to the work. They were part of the preparation as essential as the plant itself, the verbal component of a complete ritual act that required both the physical and the spoken to be complete. Different healers used different verses, but the principle was consistent across all of them. The cutting was a conversation, and the words were your part of it. In Aberdeen, young women went silently into the fields at Beltane to gather yarrow for divinatory purposes. The silence was the Aberdeen tradition's equivalent of the Irish verses. Both were ways of holding a quality of attention that ordinary speech would have interrupted and scattered. Both understood that the gathering required something from the gatherer that everyday life did not normally ask. St. John's Day, the 24th of June, appears in the folk record across several European traditions as the day of maximum magical virtue, for Yarrow gathered for protective purposes. This is the midsummer date by the old calendar, the longest day, the moment when the sun is at its fullest power and the herbs that grow in its light are understood to carry the most of whatever the sun's presence gives them. It is one of the four great turning points of the old year, the moments when the ordinary world was considered most open to what normally lay just beyond its reach. Yarrow was specifically connected to all four of the Irish fire festivals, not just midsummer, at Imbolc, the first stirring of spring, at Beltane, the height of spring's power, at Lughnasadh, the beginning of harvest, at Samhain, the edge of winter and the night when the dead were most present. At each of these turning points, Yarrow was burned or strewn in rituals of cleansing and protection, clearing what had accumulated in the household and the land during the season just ending, preparing the space, and the people for what was coming next. The plant that cleared corruption from a wound, that removed what did not belong and allowed the healing to proceed, was understood to do the same at these larger turnings of the year. The logic was continuous across scales. What Yarrow did for a wound, it could do for a household, for a community, for the land itself, at the moments when the year was open enough to allow that kind of clearing. The Druids used Yarrow for weather divination, reading signs from the plant's growth and behavior to forecast the conditions of the coming seasons, tying their observations to the agricultural and ritual calendars on which their communities depended. I want to be careful here about the distinction between magical and empirical, because in this case the two overlap in ways that are genuinely interesting rather than merely confusing. A person who has paid close attention to Yarrow across many seasons, who has watched how it grows in different conditions, how its flowering responds to temperature and moisture and the quality of the light, who has correlated these observations with what the weather did afterward, can develop a genuine predictive capacity. The plant is responsive to environmental conditions in ways that a careful observer can learn to read. Whether the Druids were reading the plant for magical signs or for genuine ecological correlations, the practice required the same quality of sustained, respectful attention, the same willingness to treat the plant as a thing worth watching, seriously and over the long term, rather than simply as a resource to be extracted at need. That quality of attention is itself significant, whatever theory of how the knowledge works underlies it. Now, the protective traditions, which are among the most consistent and widespread in Yarrow's entire folk history. The Saxons made amulets of Yarrow for personal protection and hung bundles of it over cradles to guard the infants sleeping beneath. The newborn was understood as particularly vulnerable, not yet fully established in the world, still close to the threshold it had recently crossed, susceptible to attentions and influences that a fully settled person was less open to. Yarrow over the cradle was protection at the most tender and most precarious point of a life. In the folklore of the Isle of Man, Yarrow, gathered specifically on May Eve, the night before Beltane, warded off fairies and changelings when hung above the cradle or at the door of the house. The timing here is essential and deliberate. May Eve was the night when the boundary between the ordinary world and the other one was thinnest. The threat was at its most active precisely at the moment when the protection needed to be most potent. Yarrow gathered at that charged moment carried a potency that Yarrow gathered on an ordinary afternoon in August did not. This is consistent with what we know about Yarrow's chemistry. In an unexpected way, the volatile oil content of Yarrow does vary significantly across the season, peaking at specific moments in the flowering cycle when the plant is doing its most active biochemical work. The folk tradition's insistence on gathering at particular times had practical justification buried beneath its ritual explanation. Even when the people maintaining the tradition had no framework to articulate why the timing mattered in chemical terms, the Irish travel charm places 9 blades of Yarrow in the stocking beneath the heel of the right foot, carried by the traveller setting out on a journey as protection from the evil one for the duration of the road. 9. Not 8, not 10. 9, the 3 times 3, the number that in Celtic numerological tradition signified completion, and power that exceeded ordinary counting. The right foot, not the left, and beneath the heel specifically, the most vulnerable point of the foot, the point that ground connects with at every step. The point that in the mythology of Achilles was left unprotected and proved fatal. That last connection may not be accidental. In a tradition where Yarrow was known as the herb of Achilles, where the story of the heel was associated with the failure of Yarrow's protection to reach the one place it needed to reach, placing Yarrow specifically beneath the heel of the traveler reads as a deliberate correction of the mythological precedent. What was unprotected then is protected now. The herb is present at the vulnerability. The Achilles heel is covered. Yarrow strewn across thresholds to prevent unwanted spirits from crossing appears in the European medieval record. And as I noted when we discussed the Anishinabeg, the same practice developed independently in North America. The same plant, the same location, the same principle, in two traditions that had no contact with each other. The threshold was the boundary of the home, the place where the household's integrity met the world outside it. Yarrow at the threshold declared that boundary, made it visible to whatever needed to see it, and placed the plant's protective character precisely where protection was most needed. The Welsh tradition that carrying Yarrow ensured victory in disputes brought the warrior plant into the arena of civil conflict. A person attending court, facing a legal dispute, entering a negotiation where something important was at stake, tucked Yarrow into their clothing and carried the herb that had traveled with armies. The physical battles were over, the battles of argument and judgment and the assertion of one's rights before other people had not entered, and never would. Yarrow traveled from the battlefield to the courthouse as it had traveled everywhere else, because the principle was the same. You were going into a difficult situation where the outcome was uncertain. You brought what had proven itself in difficult situations with uncertain outcomes. The Lancashire witches of Pendle Hill, in the folk tradition that gathered around them, placed Yarrow in their hats to gain the power of flight. This detail, whether historically accurate in any meaningful sense or a later elaboration on the Pendle story, connects Yarrow to the shamanic tradition of plant-assisted journeying. The use of aromatic plants to facilitate the altered states of consciousness that were understood as travel between worlds was widespread in the traditions that preceded and ran alongside the official religion of the period. Yarrow's volatile oils, in the concentrations involved in wearing bundles of the plant against the head, probably did not produce pharmacological effects strong enough to account for visions of flight in any direct sense. But the association with boundary crossing, with movement between states that are ordinarily separate, fits precisely with everything else Yarrow does in the folklore. It is always at the threshold. It is always associated with the passage from one state to another. The 18th century grimoire recipes that called for Yarrow in invisible ink sympathetic magic burned to reveal messages hidden from ordinary sight. Take this same logic into the realm of textual mystery. The visible made invisible, the invisible restored to visibility. Yarrow as the mediating agent between what is concealed and what can be revealed. The boundary between the hidden and the known, and a plant that could work at that boundary, was the appropriate material for a practice concerned with exactly that distinction. The love divination users deserve their own unhurried attention, because they are among the most human and most genuinely moving applications in Yarrow's entire history. The Suffolk charm is the most direct and perhaps the most endearing. A fresh yarrow leaf placed carefully in the nostril, the charmer reciting the words aloud without embarrassment. Green arrow, if my love loved me, my nose will bleed now. Then, waiting. This is the amphoteric property of yarrow, its documented capacity to both arrest and induce nosebleeds, depending on how and where it is used, harnessed in the service of romantic uncertainty. The plant's real, well-documented property was being directed at the question being asked. If the love was returned, the blood would confirm it. If it was not, the stillness of the blood would tell the truth that the beloved's manner might be concealing. There is something quietly brilliant in this that goes beyond superstition. The charm was built on a genuine property of the plant. It was not asking Yarrow to do something it could not do. It was directing a known capacity toward a question the heart needed answered. The folk mind that constructed this charm understood what Yarrow could do and found a way to make it speak to a human situation. That is not witchcraft in any pejorative sense. It is imagination applied to pharmacology in the service of longing. The Anglo-Scottish love charm was more formal and more literary in its character, recited over the plant before the ritual was performed, invoking Venus as Yarrow's presiding planetary influence, asking the plant to reveal in the night's dreaming what the waking world had not yet made clear. Culpeper's attribution of Yarrow to Venus, based on its affinity with female reproductive health and its general character as a plant of connection and boundary, and the management of what flows between people, gave the love charm its astrological grounding. The charm was not invented in isolation. It was built on a coherent theoretical framework in which Yarrow's association with Venus made it the appropriate mediating plant for questions about love and partnership. The pillow charm appears in several related forms across the British folk tradition, varying in its specific verses and preparations, but consistent in its essential structure. Yarrow wrapped or sewn into a small piece of flannel, placed beneath the pillow before sleep, with words recited over it as the preparation was completed. The expectation was that the sleeper would dream of the person they were to spend their life with. The choice of Yarrow for this purpose connects to everything we have established about the plant's relationship with the boundary between states. Sleep is the great boundary of daily life, the nightly passage into the unconscious where the ordinary rules of waking thought are suspended, and other kinds of knowing sometimes become available. A plant placed at the threshold of that passage, associated with boundary crossing, and with the communication of what is hidden or not yet known, was the appropriate material for asking the dreaming mind to show what the waking mind could not yet see. Whether these charms worked in the literal sense their users hoped for is a question I will leave to each person's own understanding. What I can say, as a man who has spent a lifetime attending to plants and to the people who use them, is that the practices themselves were not trivial. They were ways of holding a significant question with full attention, of creating a ritual space in which the question was treated with the seriousness it deserved. Whatever the dreaming mind produced in response, it was given the best possible conditions to produce something meaningful. Now, the Graveyard Association, which reaches deeper into Yarrow's history than almost anything else we have discussed tonight. Yarrow grows on burial mounds. It has done so as long as burial mounds have existed. And the reason is entirely consistent with everything we know about the plant's ecology. Burial mounds are disturbed ground. The earth has been broken, moved, piled, and left. Into that disturbed earth, Yarrow moves with the same readiness it brings to the margins of roads and the edges of encampments and the churned soil of battlefields. It grows from the substance of what lies beneath it, its roots threading through the earth of the dead, its white heads visible above the mound in summer, patient and apparently indifferent to what it grows from. The folk understanding that developed around this consistent and visible association was that Yarrow, growing this way from the earth of the buried, had absorbed something of those who lay beneath it, that it carried within it some capacity for communication across the boundary that the grave represented, that a plant rooted in the substance of the dead and flowering above them was uniquely positioned to mediate between the world of the living and the world of those who had passed. This belief is old enough and widespread enough to be treated as a genuine cultural observation rather than a peculiarity of one tradition. In European folk practice, Yarrow gathered from graveyards was valued specifically for workings concerned with ancestral communication, with seeking guidance from the dead, with the kind of knowledge that only the passage of a life and its completion could confer. And here we arrive at the deepest explanation for the I Ching connection, deeper than anything we touched on earlier in the night. The 50 arrow stalks of the traditional I Ching casting were not merely functionally convenient. They were the right material in a way that no other material was or could be. The I Ching at its deepest level is a system for accessing the accumulated wisdom of the ancestors, the guidance of all those who have faced difficult questions before, and whose understanding persists in some form available to those who know how to ask for it properly. The Yarrow stalks, connected across multiple cultures and multiple millennia to the dead, to the places where the dead rest, to the communication possible across the boundary of death, were the appropriate bridge between the question in the present and the wisdom held by those no longer present to speak directly. This is why the old practitioners who insisted on using Yarrow stalks rather than coins were not simply being conservative. They understood that the material was part of the meaning, that using Yarrow stalks in an I Ching casting was not the same act as using coins regardless of the numerical equivalence of the results. The stalks carried what the coins could not: the accumulated weight of a very long human understanding of Yarrow as the plant that stands between the living and the dead, and can be trusted to carry something meaningful across that boundary. The wounded healer archetype embodied by Karen, the teacher who carried an unhealable wound while spending his entire existence healing others, connects back to Yarrow in ways that the later flower essence tradition made explicit. Yarrow was Karen's plant, the herb he taught Achilles. The herb named for the student, not the teacher, and yet inseparable from the teaching, a plant associated with both the wound and the healing of the wound, with the person who suffers and the person who tends the suffering, and with the understanding that these two are not always as separate as they appear. The flower essence tradition understood Yarrow as strengthening the aura and the emotional boundaries of those whose sensitivity to others made them effective healers, and simultaneously vulnerable to what that sensitivity absorbed. The empath, in the vocabulary of that tradition, the person who feels what others feel, who carries what others bring to them, who is useful precisely because of this openness, and exhausted by the same openness over time. The plant of the soldier's wound was understood to protect the healer's openness. The plant that mediated between the living and the dead was understood to help those who worked at the edges of others' pain to maintain themselves in that work. Whether you hold this as literally true or as a coherent symbolic framework for understanding what Yarrow represents in human experience, the archetype it describes is continuous with everything else in the plant's history. Yarrow as incense, burned on charcoal in ritual contexts, for cleansing and protection, carries the fumigation tradition forward into purely ceremonial use. The same volatile oils that may have reduced microbial load in a Scottish sick room, offered now as smoke in a ritual space, were understood to clear what could not be seen or measured. The protective and purifying properties were real at one level and extended by the tradition to other levels, and the people who maintained this use did not separate these levels, because in their understanding they were not separate. I have been watching the sky while we have been talking. It is beginning to change, not light yet, but the quality of the dark has shifted slightly, the way it does in the hour before dawn becomes possible. We have covered a great deal of ground tonight, and there is still more ahead. But let me say this before we move on. The medical tradition and the magical tradition are not two separate histories of the same plant. They are the same history, told from two different angles, using two different vocabularies to describe what the people who worked most closely with Yarrow understood about it across the longest span of human time we have access to. Both traditions recognize that Yarrow operates at boundaries. The wound is a boundary, the place where the body's integrity has been breached and needs to be restored. The fever is a boundary, the passage through crisis toward recovery or toward something else. The threshold of the home is a boundary. The moment of falling into sleep is a boundary. The grave is the final boundary. In every tradition we have visited tonight, without exception, Yarrow was the plant brought to the boundary, trusted to do something at the place where things were open and uncertain, in need of protection or guidance, or the careful, reliable action of something that had proven itself in exactly these conditions more times than anyone could count. The pollen, in a grave 60,000 years old. The Yarrow, in our basket right now. The same reaching, the same trust, We are not doing anything new out here tonight. We are continuing something very old. There is a particular satisfaction, after a night like this one, in arriving at the point where the old knowledge and the new begin to speak to each other. Not because the old knowledge needed the new to validate it. The record of 60,000 years of consistent human use is its own validation. More extensive and more varied than any clinical trial could replicate. But because there is something genuinely illuminating about discovering, with the tools of modern chemistry and pharmacology, precisely why the things people observed were true, the mechanism behind the observation, the specific compound doing the specific thing that the apothecary noted, and the Lakota healer noted, and Dioscorides noted, each in their own century and their own language, without any of them being able to explain quite how the plant was producing effects so reliable that entire traditions built themselves around it. Modern science did not discover Yarrow's properties, it found out why they worked. That is a different thing, and it is worth holding the distinction clearly before we go further. The knowledge was already there. It had been there for a very long time, tested against the hardest possible standard, which is the standard of whether people who depended on it for their survival kept using it. The science arrived later and looked at the plant that all those traditions had already examined from every practical angle. And it found the molecular explanation for what the traditions had correctly described through observation alone. Let us begin with the wound, because that is where Yarrow's story began tonight, and where the scientific explanation is perhaps most satisfying in its precision. The blue color of a well-made Yarrow essential oil, the quality that apothecaries learn to read as the mark of a preparation done correctly, comes from a compound called chamazulin. Chamazulin does not exist in the fresh plant. It is formed during the distillation process itself, when sustained heat transforms a precursor compound, called matricine, into something with a vivid blue-green color and substantially more powerful anti-inflammatory properties than the precursor carried. The apothecary who prized the blue oil and learned to distrust the yellow was, without knowing it, prizing the concentration of a specific anti-inflammatory compound produced only when the distillation was conducted at the right temperature for the right duration with the right material. The skill of distillation was the skill of producing chamazulin reliably. The apothecary read the color because the color was the evidence of success. Azulene compounds, including chamazulin, have now been shown in research studies to stimulate the formation of granulation tissue in wounds. Granulation tissue is the new connective tissue and the network of small blood vessels that form at the site of a wound during healing. It is the physical mechanism by which a wound closes from the inside, building new tissue layer by layer to replace what was lost. Yarrow does not merely stop the bleeding and reduce the infection risk at a wound site. It actively promotes the construction of the replacement tissue that makes complete closure and healing possible. The Roman legionary packing crushed Yarrow into a wound was not only arresting the hemorrhage, he was without any knowledge of granulation tissue or cellular biology or the chemistry of sesquiterpenes, promoting wound repair at a level below anything he could observe. The effects were visible in the outcomes, in the wounds that closed cleanly, in the soldiers who returned to the march. The mechanism was invisible for another 2,000 years, waiting for the tools to find it. The flavonoids in Yarrow have now been characterized in considerable detail, and what the characterization reveals is a compound profile of genuine biochemical sophistication. The flavonoid apigenin, present in meaningful concentrations in Yarrow's flowering tops, has been shown in laboratory studies to bind to estrogen receptors. This is the molecular explanation for what Dioscorides described in his clinical practice in the 1st century, for what Hildegard von Bingen documented in her 12th century preparations for menstrual regulation, for what the United States Pharmacopoeia formally acknowledged in the 19th century by listing Yarrow specifically for gynecological indications, for what the Cheyenne and Navajo arrived at independently on a different continent. a specific flavonoid with a specific receptor affinity, explaining a specific clinical effect that independent observers noted on 4 continents across 2,000 years of recorded history. The traditional use was not approximate or coincidental. It was accurate. The modern mechanism confirms the observation, that the observation was always correct. The catalytic action of Yarrow, its stimulation of bile secretion and support of liver function in fat digestion, has been confirmed in animal models through the study of decaffuelquinic acids isolated from the plant. These are the compounds responsible for the bitter digestive effect that made Yarrow tea a standard household practice after heavy meals across much of European history. The Chinese practitioner directing Yarrow at liver qi stagnation, the European apothecary prescribing it as a digestive bitter, the Persian physician including it in compound formulas for gastrointestinal pain. All of them were watching the same set of compounds doing the same biochemical work on the same organ system. In different languages, within different theoretical frameworks, they had all arrived at the same correct observation. The anti-inflammatory mechanisms of Yarrow extend considerably beyond the azulene compounds and the flavonoids. Laboratory studies have shown that Yarrow extracts inhibit human neutrophil elastase, an enzyme central to the inflammatory cascade, the sequence of cellular events that produces the heat, swelling, and pain we associate with inflammation. Inhibiting neutrophil elastase reduces inflammation at a more fundamental level than the surface astringency of the tannins achieves. It interferes with the process that drives inflammation before the visible symptoms fully develop, rather than simply contracting the tissue in which those symptoms have already manifested. This means the anti-inflammatory action operates through at least 3 distinct mechanisms simultaneously. The tannins contracting inflamed tissue, the flavonoids modulating inflammatory signaling pathways, the azulene compounds promoting tissue repair, the neutrophil elastase inhibitors interfering with the inflammatory cascade upstream. 4 separate mechanisms running in parallel, each addressing a different aspect of the same underlying problem. This layered quality is part of what makes Yarrow unusual as a therapeutic agent and part of what the traditional record was trying to describe when it called the plant polyfunctional or named it the herb of 7 cures. It was not doing one thing and being credited with many. It was genuinely doing many things through distinct mechanisms, and the traditions that worked with it closely enough and long enough had observed the full range of what it was doing, even without the language, to explain how. One of the most remarkable findings in recent Yarrow research concerns its effect on the most fundamental level of tissue repair when aqueous Yarrow extract was applied to mesenchymal stem cells in controlled laboratory conditions. The extract was found to boost these cells' capacity for both self-renewal and differentiation. These are the 2 properties that define a stem cell's usefulness in tissue repair. Self-renewal means the stem cell population can sustain itself, producing more cells capable of becoming whatever the repair requires. Differentiation means those cells can become the specific tissue types the wound site needs. Mesenchymal stem cell research was not a concept available to any practitioner in the history of Yarrow's use before the late 20th century. The cellular mechanisms of tissue regeneration were entirely beyond the reach of traditional observation, and yet Yarrow was doing something to those mechanisms, something that modern laboratory methods can now detect and describe, that sits below the level of anything the apothecary or the field surgeon could see in their patient. The wound herb was operating at the level of the cells that build the wound's replacement tissue, promoting the fundamental biological process of regeneration from a depth that only became visible to science within living memory. The hepatoprotective properties of Yarrow, its capacity to protect liver cells from damage, appear in modern pharmacognosy texts alongside the antispasmodic properties that the traditional record documented so extensively across so many cultures. Both of these findings mirror traditional applications that appeared independently in multiple traditions, and that were described in each tradition's own terms as accurate observations about what Yarrow did for the organ systems involved. The ethnomedical surveys conducted in recent decades mapping what folk systems worldwide actually used Yarrow for across living memory and documented historical practice, consistently identifies spasmodic and inflammatory gastrointestinal conditions as among the most widespread applications. This aligns precisely with what the research into Yarrow's antispasmodic volatile oils and anti-inflammatory flavonoids would predict for those conditions. And it confirms that folk practitioners, working without any pharmacological knowledge, were applying the plant accurately to the conditions where its specific compound profile was most directly relevant. The essential oil, characterized now in full analytical detail, carries the strong antioxidant and broad antimicrobial activity that the apothecary exploited in wound preparations and preserved salves. The monoterpenes and sesquiterpenes that give Yarrow oil its complexity and its potency are understood now in terms of their specific mechanisms of antimicrobial action, the ways in which they disrupt bacterial and fungal cell membranes and interfere with the metabolic processes that pathogens depend on. The self-preserving salve that resisted spoilage through the winter was doing so because of a specific and now well-characterized biochemistry. The apothecary who read the color and the smell of the oil to assess its quality was making correct empirical judgments about a chemistry they could not have nailed. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the azulene content of Yarrow oil had attracted enough pharmaceutical attention that the compound was incorporated into commercial skin products marketed specifically for anti-inflammatory effects. This was the moment when Yarrow's chemistry crossed from the traditional apothecary trade into the early industrial pharmaceutical industry. Its compounds isolated, characterized, and repackaged in forms that served the same purposes the old preparations had always served, while presenting them in the new language of scientific validation. Now let me tell you about the clinical finding that I have returned to in my thoughts more than once this evening, because it speaks to something important about the depth of Yarrow's therapeutic reach. A year-long clinical trial tested the effect of 500 milligrams of Yarrow daily on patients living with multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis is an autoimmune and neuroinflammatory condition in which the body's immune system attacks the myelin sheath of the central nervous system, disrupting the transmission of nerve signals in ways that produce a wide range of progressive neurological symptoms. It has no connection, at first glance, to the wound and bleeding applications that form the backbone of Yarrow's traditional history. It would not appear on any historical apothecary's list of Yarrow's indications, because it was not a recognized condition before the modern era, and its underlying mechanisms were not understood until very recently. The trial found that patients receiving Yarrow showed reduced relapse rates compared to the control group, reduced lesion volume on neuroimaging, reduced fatigue scores, reduced spasticity. These are meaningful clinical outcomes in a condition where meaningful symptom reduction is genuinely difficult to achieve, and where any intervention that reduces relapse rate has substantial implications for the patient's long-term prognosis. They are explained by Yarrow's multi-mechanistic anti-inflammatory action. The same action that Pliny and Dioscorides were observing from the outside in the 1st century, when they noted the plant's effects on infectious and inflammatory disease. The same action the Persian physicians were working with when they included it in formulas for chronic conditions. The same action the Chinese tradition addressed when it directed Yarrow at liver qi stagnation. Neuroinflammation is inflammation. Yarrow addresses inflammation through at least 4 distinct mechanisms simultaneously. The application is not as surprising as it first appears, once you understand the depth and the breadth of the compound profile the plant contains. The battlefield herb, demonstrating clinical relevance in a neurological autoimmune condition, is not a contradiction. It is the full expression of a compound profile that was always more extensive than the wound applications alone would suggest. The traditional record hinted at this breadth in every application that went beyond the wound. The modern research is mapping it in detail. The oral mucositis finding that we encountered in the Iranian clinical tradition continues to attract research attention. Chemotherapy-induced oral mucositis is a significant clinical problem that reduces quality of life and can compromise treatment adherence in patients already managing an enormous treatment burden. A preparation derived from a traditional Iranian use of yarrow, tested in a clinical setting, providing superior relief to the standard treatment alone, is the convergence of a 3,000-year empirical tradition with a clinical need that did not exist in any form, recognizable to the practitioners who built that tradition. They were applying yarrow to inflamed mucous membranes because they had observed that it helped. They had no concept of chemotherapy, no concept of the specific cellular damage that cytotoxic agents cause to rapidly dividing mucosal cells. They simply knew the plant's relationship with inflamed tissue, and they applied it, and they recorded what happened. And they passed the knowledge on 2,000 years later. A clinical trial confirmed that the knowledge they passed on was accurate enough to be useful in a situation they could not have imagined. The Himalayan grandmothers in the villages of Himachal Pradesh, who still recommend yarrow decoctions for postpartum recovery, are maintaining a living thread of knowledge that runs back through Persian trade routes and Ayurvedic adaptation to Dioscorides writing about uterine hemorrhage in the 1st century. They are not aware of that connection. They do not need to be. The knowledge was given to them by the women who raised them, tested against the reality of postpartum recovery in their own communities, and maintained because it continued to be needed and to work. That is the living continuation of botanical knowledge at its most direct and most durable, not archived, not institutionalized, not dependent on any texts surviving any particular library fire or any particular regime's hostility to the old ways. Simply passed from hand to hand, mother to daughter, generation to generation, through the unbroken practice of people who needed it and used it and found it worth keeping. Modern Western herbalists maintain the core of the apothecary tradition with the same consistency. Yarrow in tinctures for fevers and digestive complaints, yarrow tea for menstrual discomfort, yarrow salve for wounds and skin inflammation, yarrow in the first aid kit as the emergency preparation for minor bleeding. Contemporary herbal education presents these applications in terms that the classical and medieval texts would recognize, because those terms remain accurate descriptions of what the plant does and how to use it. The modern safety monographs have added the qualification that the potent essential oil and the sesquiterpene lactones require dosage awareness and attention to individual sensitivity. Some people develop contact dermatitis from sustained exposure to yarrow. The sesquiterpene lactones can produce reactions in people with sensitivities to other members of the Astracea family. These are real considerations that represent the appropriate integration of traditional use knowledge with pharmacological scrutiny, and they reflect the kind of care with a complex and potent plant that the best traditional apothecaries always maintain. The contemporary literature has arrived at a description of yarrow that the most thoughtful traditional practitioners would have recognized immediately, expressed in a vocabulary they would not have used, but pointing at the same thing their experience had taught them. A polyfunctional wound herb, a multi-target phytotherapeutic agent, a single plant that combines wound healing, anti-infective, antispasmodic, circulatory, and hepatoprotective actions in a compound profile that addresses the most common and most serious conditions of human physical life through mechanisms that reinforce and extend each other rather than operating in isolation. The herb of 7 cures, described in modern pharmacological language. Life medicine, confirmed by clinical trial. The healer, doing what healers do, what it has always done in the wound and in the nerve and in the postpartum body and in the inflamed mouth of a chemotherapy patient. And in everything between. The sky has lightened considerably now. The grey of the pre-dawn hour has become something more definite, and the shapes in the field around us have acquired the first suggestion of color. The whiteheads of the yarrow are still the brightest things visible, catching what light there is with the same patient steadiness they have held through the whole of this long night. The basket is full, I believe we have what we came for. And perhaps a little more besides. And so we reach the end of our long night together. The sky is lighter now than when we came out. Not fully light, but the dark has changed its quality, the way it does in the hour before dawn becomes possible. The shapes in the field are visible without effort, and the Yarrow heads are still there, white and steady, exactly where they were when we arrived. They will still be there tomorrow, and the day after, as they have been in fields like this one, for longer than we have been the kind of creature that notices them. We have covered a great deal of ground tonight. From pollen in a Neanderthal grave to a clinical trial measuring Yarrow's effect on multiple sclerosis. From Charon teaching Achilles in the hills above ancient Greece to a Roman legionary packing the same plant into a wound in Gaul. From Hildegard von Bingen, wrapping it warm around an insomniac's head to the Anishinaabe woman, placing it across her threshold to guard what she loved most. From the I Ching casting stalks held in 10,000 pairs of careful hands to the Suffolk charmer pressing a leaf to her nose and waiting to see if her love was returned. We have learned that Yarrow's pollen was carried into graves 60,000 years ago, before writing, before cities, before bronze, before almost everything we point to when we want to describe the beginning of human civilization, and that the people who placed it there understood something about this plant that they could not have written down, and did not need to. We have learned that Homer placed it in Western literature's first great poem, that the Romans named it Herba Militaris, and that the name was earned that Dioscorides described its gynecological applications in the 1st century, and has not been wrong about them since. We have learned that it followed every human route across the old world without being deliberately carried, because it grew in disturbed ground, and human beings have always made disturbed ground wherever they went. And that, when it arrived in new traditions, in China and Persia, and the Ayurvedic world and the Ottoman Empire, each of those traditions looked at it carefully and arrived independently at the same conclusions the others had already reached. We have learned that the Lakota called it medicine for the wounded, and that this name, simple as it sounds, may be the most accurate description anyone has ever given it. We have learned that it was strewn on church floors and brewed into ale and ground into tooth powder and infused into honey and distilled into a blue oil that apothecaries learned to read like a quality mark, that it was placed under pillows by young women who wanted to dream of their futures, that it was tucked under the heel of the right foot by travelers who needed protecting on the road, that it stood at every threshold, at the wound, at the fever, at the grave, at the door of the home, at the edge of sleep itself. Always at the boundary, always the thing that was brought when something needed to cross from one state to another, and the crossing required help. And we have learned that when modern chemistry finally arrived with its tools and its vocabulary, what it found inside the plant confirmed everything. The chamazulene in the blue oil, the apigenin binding to the receptors that Dioscorides had described from the outside 2,000 years before, the granulation tissue forming at the wound site, the inflammatory cascade being quietly interrupted by compounds that the apothecary never named and never needed to name because he could see the results clearly enough without them. The observation was always correct. The mechanism was simply waiting for the language to catch up. The plant is still here. In every field like this one, every roadside, every garden where someone has not yet decided it is a weed and removed it, still doing what it has always done. Patient as only something 60,000 years old can be patient, requiring nothing from us except the occasional willingness to stop and pay attention. I hope you have found something useful in this long night's conversation. Perhaps a new regard for something you have passed many times without stopping, perhaps simply the hours themselves, the slow passage through something ancient and worth understanding. The particular rest that comes from spending time in the company of something that does not hurry, and does not doubt itself. That is its own kind of medicine, and one I am glad to have been able to offer. To everyone who left a word in the comments, who told me where in the world they were, what city, what hour, what quality of darkness surrounded them when they came out into this field. Thank you, genuinely. You are what makes this worth doing. To everyone who passed this evening along to someone else, who said simply, I think you might want to hear this. Thank you also. That is how good things travel. The same way Yarrow does, following the roots, appearing where people are, making itself available to whoever will pay attention. I hope you are comfortable wherever you are. I hope the night is gentle, the body easy, the mind quieter now than it was when you first stepped into this field. And if sleep has not yet come, I believe it is very close now, waiting just at the edge of the next slow breath patient as the Yarrow, ready to arrive without announcement, the way the best things do. From this field, in this particular darkness, with the basket full and the long work of the night complete, and the whiteheads of the Yarrow still steady in the grass around us. Good night. You have been good company. We both have 60,000 years of people who reached for this plant when they needed it and found it there. As I hope, sleep finds you now.